Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Get yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket up, find your position, let the room get soft and quiet around you. If you've got a fan running somewhere, perfect. If not, just settle in exactly as you are, because tonight we're going somewhere genuinely wonderful. We're going to the 1950s, not the glamorous Hollywood version, not Marilyn Monroe on a movie set, not a magazine cover under studio lighting. We're going somewhere more interesting than that. We're going into the ordinary bathroom of an ordinary woman on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and we are going to watch what she does. Because what she does is remarkable, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. Tonight's topic is beauty in the 1950s. The real thing. The daily rituals, the homemade recipes, the tricks passed from mother to daughter in kitchens and dressing rooms and beauty parlours with pink vinyl chairs. The things women did to their hair, their skin, their teeth, their figures, their faces, not just for special occasions, but every single day, as naturally as making coffee and setting the breakfast table. And here is what I want you to know before we even begin. These women were not vain. They were not obsessed with appearances in some shallow, frivolous way. They were practitioners. They were scientists of the everyday. They had inherited centuries of accumulated feminine knowledge about the human body. What works, what doesn't, what hurts less than it should. And they applied that knowledge with a quiet, steady expertise that we have almost entirely forgotten. So let's go back. Let's learn what they knew. The alarm goes off at 6 in the morning, maybe 6:15. The house is still dark, the husband still sleeping, the children not yet making their familiar morning noise. And the woman of the house, let's call her Joan, because that was the most common woman's name in America in 1952, Joan is already moving toward the bathroom. She doesn't hurry. She has a system. She has always had a system. And the first thing Joan does before she touches her face, before she reaches for a single product, is drink a full glass of water. This sounds so simple that it almost doesn't seem worth mentioning. But it was intentional. It was taught. Joan's mother told her to do it. Her mother's mother told her mother. The logic, as they understood it, was that your skin spent all night in the dry air of a bedroom breathing, releasing moisture, slowly becoming something just slightly less plump and dewy than it had been when you fell asleep. Water first thing in the morning was the correction. It was maintenance. It was the signal to every cell in your body that the day was beginning and everything needed to wake up and start working. Modern nutritionists and dermatologists have confirmed that this instinct was correct. Morning hydration does help with skin elasticity, digestion, and the general alertness of someone who's been horizontal and breathing recycled air for 8 hours. Joan did not know the science. She just knew it worked, because she could see the difference in her face on the morning she skipped it. Now she's at the mirror, and the mirror in a 1950s bathroom told no lies. The lighting was usually a single bulb overhead, or 2 flanking the mirror if you were lucky, and it was the kind of light that showed everything, every crease from the pillow, every shadow under the eyes, every patch of dry skin at the corners of the mouth. Joan looked at herself for a moment without judgment, just assessment. She was not trying to look like a movie star. She was trying to look like herself, on a good day, put together, presentable, the kind of woman who looked like she took herself seriously. And that assessment, that calm, clear-eyed look in the mirror first thing in the morning, was itself a beauty practice, because what Joan was doing was noticing. She was tracking her own face the way a gardener tracks a garden. Is there more puffiness than yesterday? Is the skin around my nose drier than usual? Did something I ate last night leave a mark on my complexion? She was paying attention, and that attention informed every choice she made in the next 20 minutes. The first thing she reached for was not a cleanser, not in the way we would understand it. There were commercial cleansers available in the 1950s. Cold cream had been a staple since at least the 1890s, and by the mid-20th century brands like Pond's and Noxzema were household names. But Joan's first move was often something simpler. A damp cloth, warm water, a gentle press against the closed eyes, then the forehead, then the cheeks. She was doing what women had done for centuries before the beauty industry existed, using warmth to open the pores and water to clear away what the night had left behind. After that, the cold cream. And here I want to slow down because cold cream in the 1950s was not just a product, it was a philosophy. The formula had barely changed since the ancient world. Beeswax, mineral oil, water, and usually a little borax to hold it all together. Some versions used rose water, some used lanolin. The cheapest drugstore variety smelled faintly of something between flowers and petroleum, and women used it without embarrassment because it worked. You massaged it into the face in upward-outward circles, always upward, never dragging the skin down, and then you wiped it away with a soft cloth, and with it came the remnants of the previous day, traces of powder, the ghost of lipstick, whatever had settled into the creases of the face while you slept. Cold cream was both a cleanser and a treatment. The oils it left behind after you wiped it away were not residue. They were intentional. They were the moisture your skin needed to face the morning. And here is a detail that I find genuinely interesting, because it contradicts almost everything the modern skincare industry would have you believe. Women who used cold cream in the 1950s and continued using it into old age routinely had skin that was softer and more elastic than women who switched to harsher cleansers and stripped their faces down to what they thought of as clean. The cold cream ladies had fewer fine lines at 60 than many women have at 40 today. The reason is simple, though it takes a moment to appreciate. Harsh cleansers strip the skin of its natural sebum, the oil your sebaceous glands produce to protect and lubricate the skin. When that oil is removed, the skin overproduces it in compensation, leading to the cycle of oiliness and dryness and breakouts that so many modern women struggle with. Cold cream, which is essentially an oil in water emulsion, works with the skin's chemistry instead of against it. It cleans, but it doesn't strip. It removes, but it also gives back. Jo knew none of this in scientific terms. She just knew that her skin felt better when she used it than when she didn't. That was enough. After cleansing came toning. Not the spray bottle toners of the modern world, not the acid exfoliants and serums in minimalist bottles. Joan's toner was likely witch hazel, applied to a cotton ball and swept across the face in that same upward-outward motion. Witch hazel had been a staple of American beauty since the 19th century. It's an astringent derived from the bark and leaves of the Hamamelis virginiana plant, and it tightens the appearance of pores, reduces redness, and has mild antiseptic properties. Dollar for dollar, it was and is one of the most effective skincare ingredients that exists. Some women used apple cider vinegar diluted in water instead, or rose water, or a combination of both. Some used nothing after the cold cream and went straight to moisturizer. There was no single correct answer. What unified all of these choices was the underlying principle. After cleaning, you restore the skin's natural pH and prepare it for whatever comes next. The moisturizer that came next was usually simple. Jergens lotion. Lubriderm. Something with a light, not quite sweet scent, and a texture thin enough to absorb quickly. Or, for women who swore by it, a fingertip of petroleum jelly worked into the driest spots. The corners of the mouth, the outer corners of the eyes, the bridge of the nose where skin tends to become tight and papery in dry weather. Petroleum jelly as a beauty product sounds unlikely to modern ears, but it was and remains one of the most scientifically validated moisturizers available. It creates a seal over the skin surface that prevents transepidermal water loss, the technical term for the moisture that evaporates out of skin constantly, all day, especially in dry climates and heated indoor air. The skin underneath that seal stays hydrated. It heals faster. It ages more slowly. Women in the 1950s who applied a thin layer of petroleum jelly to their lips and the outer corners of their eyes before bed, and then switched to a lighter day moisturizer in the mornings, were following a regimen that modern estheticians would charge significant money to recommend. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Joan hasn't done her makeup yet. She's barely started. And before we get to the makeup, we need to talk about the hair, because the hair in 1950s beauty was not an afterthought. It was the centerpiece. It was in many ways the whole thing. The relationship a 1950s woman had with her hair, was unlike anything that exists today. It was intimate in a way that goes beyond the word intimate. She slept with it, she pinned it, she steamed it, she set it, she covered it in the rain and guarded it against humidity, and devoted more cognitive energy to its daily management than most modern people devote to their finances, and she was not unusual for doing so. Every woman around her was doing the same thing. Let's start with the night before, because you cannot understand 1950s hair without understanding the night before. Joan went to bed with curlers in her hair, not always every night, but often enough that the curlers had become just another part of sleeping, and there is something quietly remarkable about that, about the way she had arranged her entire sleeping life around the preservation of a hairstyle. The curlers of the 1950s came in several forms. The most common for home use were pin curls, sections of hair wound flat against the head and secured with a bobby pin or two, drying into a curl or wave by morning. Pin curls took practice. You had to know which direction to wind them based on the final look you wanted, which parts to make tighter for more defined curls, and which to leave looser for soft waves, and how to secure them without creating the kind of crease that would show in the finished style. Women who had been doing this since their teens made it look effortless. Women who were new to it had visible dents in their curls for years while they learned. Larger brush rollers were used for volume and wave rather than tight curls. These were foam or plastic cylinders with bristles that gripped the hair as it was wound around them. They were not comfortable to sleep on. That is not an exaggeration. Sleeping in brush rollers was an act of commitment that women performed regularly because the alternative, waking up with flat, unstyled hair and having to somehow fix it in the 20 minutes between the alarm and breakfast, was not acceptable. There was also the rag curl method, which sounds antiquated, but produced some of the most beautiful, bouncy curls available to home beauty practitioners. Strips of soft fabric, cut from old cotton shirts or pillowcases, were used to wrap sections of damp hair and tied off at the end. The fabric was gentle, didn't crease the hair the way hard rollers could, and slept on considerably more comfortably than anything made of plastic. Women who grew up with rag curls often swore by them well into adulthood, long after commercial rollers were available. In the morning, after unwinding every curl or roller, came the brushing, and this brushing was not casual. It was not a few quick strokes in front of the mirror while mentally composing a grocery list. It was a deliberate, focused practice, sometimes 50 strokes, sometimes 100, working section by section, using a natural bristle brush that distributed the scalp's natural oils down the length of each hair shaft. The science behind this, which the women practicing it understood only intuitively, is that natural bristle brushes, boar bristle most commonly, have a texture similar to human hair. That similarity allows them to grip and move the sebum produced by the scalp's glands without stripping it away entirely, redistributing it to the ends of the hair where it prevents breakage and adds shine. Women who brushed this way had hair that gleamed in a way that's difficult to replicate with modern products because they were using the hair's own oils as a conditioner. They also washed their hair far less frequently than we do now, once a week in many households, twice a week for some. The idea of washing hair every day was not just impractical in the 1950s, it was understood to be actively bad for the hair, and this understanding was correct. Daily washing strips the scalp of its natural oils, triggering overproduction of sebum as the glands compensate for what's been removed. The hair becomes greasier faster, requiring more frequent washing, creating a cycle that the beauty industry of every subsequent decade has been delighted to support. The women of the 1950s, washing once or twice a week, had naturally balanced scalps that produced exactly as much oil as the hair needed, and no more. When they did wash, many of them used products we would not recognize as shampoo. Castile soap diluted in warm water was common, particularly in households where the family had been making do with simpler products for a long time. Egg shampoo, an actual egg, beaten and massaged into wet hair, was used by women who understood that the proteins in egg whites strengthen the hair shaft while the yolk's fats condition. This sounds messy and difficult, and it was a little, but the results were undeniable. Lemon juice diluted with water and used as a final rinse after washing brightened dull blonde hair and helped cut through any soap residue. Apple cider vinegar rinses did the same for darker hair, restoring shine by sealing the hair's cuticle, which is the protective outer layer of each strand. When the cuticle lies flat, light reflects off it evenly and hair looks glossy. When it's raised or damaged, light scatters and hair looks dull. The mildly acidic pH of both lemon juice and apple cider vinegar helps the cuticle lie flat. Women who used these rinses regularly had hair that photographers couldn't stop shooting because the natural light caught it so beautifully. Beer was another popular hair rinse in the 1950s, and not just as a joke passed between women at the beauty parlor. Flat beer, the carbonation let out because fizz dries the hair, contains proteins and B vitamins that temporarily strengthen and thicken each hair strand. Women with fine, limp hair who struggled to achieve the full, round styles the decade demanded found that a flat beer rinse gave their hair the body it needed to hold a set without resorting to excessive products. You rinsed the beer out completely afterward, so you wouldn't smell like a brewery, but the thickening effect stayed. Setting lotion was the next step in the hair ritual, applied to damp hair before the rollers went in. In the early 1950s, many women made their own by dissolving a small amount of sugar or gelatin in warm water and letting it cool. It sounds completely unremarkable, almost laughably simple. But sugar and gelatin both create a light film over the hair shaft that stiffens slightly as it dries, giving curls and waves the structure they need to hold their shape through the day. Commercial setting lotions worked on the same principle, just with added fragrance and marketing. The beauty parlor, though, was where the more elaborate chemistry happened. Women visited their beauty parlor weekly in many cases, or at minimum every 2 weeks, for a shampoo and set. The beauty parlor of the 1950s was not a salon in the modern sense. It was a social institution. It was the place where news traveled, where the real conversations happened, where women sat under the heat of a hood dryer for 20 minutes and caught up on everything that had happened in the neighborhood since last Tuesday. The permanents offered at the beauty parlor, perms, were a genuine feat of chemistry. A permanent wave, properly done, involved applying an alkaline solution to the hair that broke down the disulfide bonds in the hair's protein structure, allowing the hair to be reshaped around rods of whatever diameter would produce the desired curl. A neutralizing solution was then applied to reform those bonds in the new shape. Done correctly, the result lasted months. Done incorrectly, with solution that was too strong, or left on too long, or applied to hair that was already damaged, the results ranged from hair that felt like straw to hair that broke off at the scalp. The women who sat in those chairs understood, at least vaguely, that they were making a chemical trade. They were choosing style over the hair's natural condition, and they accepted that trade because the resulting curl, the resulting body and shape, gave them the look they were working toward. The skilled operators who knew exactly how long to leave each solution on, who could look at a client's hair and immediately assess how porous it was and how it would respond, those women were artists. The less skilled ones were the reason hair horror stories circulated at dinner tables across America throughout the decade. Now, we've talked about the skin, we've talked about the hair, and Joan is still standing in front of the mirror at 6:30 in the morning. Let's do the makeup. Makeup in the 1950s was specific, it was intentional, it was nothing like the way we think about makeup today, where the prevailing aesthetic ranges from barely there natural to elaborate artistic expression. In the 1950s, the goal was clear. You were trying to look like a more polished, more vivid, more precisely defined version of yourself. Not different, just more. The foundation came first. A 1950s foundation was not the light coverage tinted moisturizers or the sheer skin tints of contemporary beauty. It was actual foundation, a slightly thick matte finish liquid or cream that evened out the skin tone completely, providing a uniform, smooth base for everything that came after. Brands like Max Factor and Revlon and Elizabeth Arden were the rulers of this space, and their formulations were designed to provide real coverage because the standard of the era required real coverage. The shade selection, though, is where modern women would find themselves surprised. The range of shades available, particularly in the early part of the decade, was narrow in a way that reflected both the limits of cosmetic technology and the narrowness of who the beauty industry at that time imagined its customer to be. This is a real historical fact that shouldn't be glossed over. The industry expanded its shade range slowly and reluctantly over the course of the decade, and women of color developed their own parallel beauty practices, home formulations, mixing, the extraordinary creativity that comes from being excluded from an industry that was supposed to serve you, that deserved their own entire conversation. Application technique mattered as much as the product itself. The goal was to apply foundation lightly enough that it didn't sit visibly on the skin like a mask, but thoroughly enough that it provided the evening smoothing effect it was supposed to. Women applied it with damp sponges, or, more traditionally, with the tips of their fingers, working in downward strokes rather than rubbing, so that fine facial hair lay flat rather than being dragged upright against the direction of growth. A dusting of loose powder set the foundation. This step was not optional. Loose powder in the 1950s was the difference between a finished face and an unfinished one. Translucent powders were available but not universally used. More common was a face powder that was one shade lighter than the foundation, which created a matte porcelain finish that photographed beautifully in black and white. The compact and the powder puff were carried in every handbag. They were used throughout the day, pressed gently to the T-zone and chin where oil tended to break through the powder layer. Women powdered their noses with the same unself-conscious regularity with which we might glance at our phones, and without any embarrassment, because touching up your face in the ladies' room mirror was understood as maintenance, not vanity. Blush came next, and in the early 1950s it was almost always called rouge, which is just the French word for red. The application technique was distinct from what most people think of as contouring today. The goal was not to sculpt the face or create illusions of cheekbone structure. The goal was to make the face look alive, to add warmth and color to a complexion that had been flattened and neutralized by the matte foundation and powder. Rouge went on the apples of the cheeks, swept lightly upward toward the temples, with a generous hand that we would now consider alarming, but which looked completely correct on film and in natural light, in an era when faces were not photographed from 3 inches away in high definition. Then the eyes, and this is where the 1950s face gets its particular, unmistakable character. Eyebrow shaping in the 1950s was an art form with its own schools of thought. The dominant brow aesthetic of the early decade was the high arch, a brow that had been dramatically thinned by plucking or waxing and then redrawn with a pencil in a precise, slightly exaggerated arch that started above the inner corner of the eye, peaked roughly above the outer edge of the iris, and tapered to a defined point. This brow required considerable skill to reproduce and daily upkeep to maintain. The eyebrow pencil of the era was harder and more precise than modern formulations. Women learnt to use a very light hand, drawing tiny hair-like strokes rather than a single continuous line, and then blending with a small brush or the tip of a finger so the effect looked as natural as something that carefully constructed could look. Getting the arch symmetrical was the challenge that every woman who wore the high arch brow had to solve for herself. There were no stencils in most homes. There was just the mirror, the pencil, and practice. Years and years of practice that eventually made it automatic. Eyeshadow in the early 1950s was subtle by the standards of what came later in the decade. Pale, neutral, almost skin-like shades dominated the beginning of the era. Champagne, ivory, the faintest blush pink applied to the mobile lid and blended to nothing at the crease. As the decade progressed and the influence of both Hollywood glamour and European fashion houses deepened, color began to enter the palette. Dusty roses and soft corals appeared on the lids of fashion-forward women. By the late 1950s, particularly under the influence of Christian Dior's look and the rock and roll energy beginning to creep into mainstream culture, more saturated shades were gaining ground. Eyeliner was a different story. Eyeliner was not subtle. Eyeliner was the precision instrument that defined the 1950s face more than any other single product. Applied to the upper lash line with a small brush dipped in liquid liner, or with a sharpened kohl pencil for a slightly softer effect, the liner of the era was drawn as close to the lashes as possible, and then extended slightly beyond the outer corner of the eye, in a small flick or wing that lifted the eye's shape upward and outward. The trick to this, and women shared it in whispers at beauty counters and beauty parlors, because good liner technique was something you learnt from someone, not from a book, was to not draw the line in one continuous stroke. Instead, you made a series of tiny connected dots or short strokes along the lash line, then connected them into a smooth line, then cleaned up any wobbles with a cotton swab barely dampened with a little cold cream. The connected dots approach was more controllable than trying to drag a brush across a curved, moving surface in a single motion, and the cold cream cleanup trick was far gentler on the delicate skin around the eye than the harsher makeup removers that would have been required otherwise. Mascara in the early 1950s was cake mascara, A little cake of product that you wet with saliva or water and then worked a small brush through before applying to the lashes. Yes, saliva. The enzymes in saliva helped the mascara apply more smoothly, and every woman who used cake mascara knew this and did it without a second thought. Tube mascara became more widely available through the decade, and by the late 1950s was the dominant format, but the technique remained largely the same. Multiple thin coats, letting each coat dry briefly before the next, working from the root of the lash to the tip in small zigzag motions that deposited product along the length of each lash rather than just at the tip. Women with sparse lashes used a technique that still works today, a cotton swab with just a trace of mascara on it, pressed against the base of the upper lashes and rolled slightly upward. This deposited color right at the lash line, where it did double duty as both mascara and a subtle smudgy liner, thickening the lash base and making the whole eye look fuller without requiring the precision of a liquid liner wing. The lips, the 1950s lip. There has never been a decade before or since in which the lip was quite so central to the face's overall power. The full, precisely outlined, deeply pigmented lip of a 1950s woman was not an accident or a lucky genetic gift. It was constructed. It was drawn and filled and blotted and redrawn with a deliberateness that made it something close to architecture. Lip liner came first. This was not an optional step. Lip liner was the foundation upon which everything else rested. The liner pencil, usually a shade slightly deeper than the lipstick it would frame, was used to draw a precise edge around the lip, sometimes following the natural lip line exactly, and sometimes slightly overdrawing it, particularly in the Cupid's bow area of the upper lip and at the corners of the mouth, to create the impression of a fuller, more clearly defined lip than nature had actually provided. The secret that women knew and passed along to each other was that lip liner serves a double purpose. Yes, it defines the lip's edge, but it also prevents the lipstick from bleeding into the fine lines around the mouth that tend to appear as women age, the small vertical creases above and below the lip line that will grab a pigmented lipstick and draw it upward like a wick drawing oil. Liner acts as a dam. It keeps the color where it's meant to be. The lipstick itself was coral, or red, or berry, or the cool blue red that dominated the very early part of the decade under the influence of the 1940s glamour that was only just receding. Colors were saturated and unapologetic. The era believed that lipstick should be seen. There was no shy berry gloss in 1952. There was color, and there was no color, and most women chose color. Application was a craft. Women applied lipstick directly from the bullet, pressing firmly from the center of the upper lip outward to each corner, then from the center of the lower lip outward. Then they pressed their lips together, not rubbing, just pressing, to transfer a light layer of color to the areas the bullet hadn't directly reached. Then a single sheet of tissue placed between the lips and pressed. The blotted layer was the foundation. A second coat applied over the first gave depth and staying power that a single unblotted coat never achieved. This technique, 2 coats with a blot between them, is still one of the most effective methods for making any lipstick last. The first coat, blotted, essentially becomes a stain. The second coat provides the color and sheen. Together, they create a lip color that survives coffee and lunch and a conversation and 1,000 small moments of daily life, with far more dignity than a single thick coat ever manages. Some women dusted a trace of translucent powder over the blotted first coat before applying the second. This sounds like overkill. It is in fact the difference between lipstick that lasts 3 hours and lipstick that lasts 6. The powder sets the first coat the way it sets foundation, creating a surface the second coat can grip. Joan's face is done. It took her 25 minutes, maybe 30. She's wearing it as lightly and naturally as she wears her clothes. It's part of how she presents herself to the world, and she would feel as undressed without it as she would feel going out without brushing her teeth. Which brings us actually to the teeth. The dental care practices of the 1950s were more sophisticated than most people expect, and the household remedies women used for their teeth are fascinating because so many of them hold up entirely under modern examination. Baking soda had been used as a tooth powder since long before the 1950s, and it remained common in that decade among women who either couldn't afford commercial toothpaste or had simply learnt from their mothers that it worked perfectly well. Baking soda is a mild abrasive that removes surface stains without damaging enamel. Its particles are softer than enamel, which means they'll scrub away discoloration without scratching the underlying tooth structure. It also raises the pH in the mouth, making the environment temporarily less hospitable to the acid-producing bacteria responsible for cavities. Women who used baking soda for their teeth often mixed it with a little hydrogen peroxide, not the concentrated form you'd use to bleach fabric, but diluted drugstore hydrogen peroxide mixed into a paste for additional whitening. This combination of baking soda and hydrogen peroxide is the active core of the most expensive professional whitening products available today. Women in the 1950s were mixing it at their bathroom sinks for a few cents. Salt was another tooth treatment, used either as a rinse, a teaspoon dissolved in warm water, swished around the mouth for a minute, or occasionally as a mild abrasive mixed with the baking soda paste. Salt has real antimicrobial properties and is particularly effective at reducing gum inflammation. Women whose gums bled or ached would often salt rinse daily until the problem resolved, and in many cases it did, because what they were treating was often simple bacterial overgrowth that the salt was effectively controlling. For tooth whitening that went beyond the baking soda routine, some women used the inside of a strawberry rubbed directly over the teeth. Strawberries contain malic acid, which acts as a gentle chemical exfoliant on tooth enamel, lifting surface stains in a manner similar to the way a fruit acid might exfoliate skin. It worked. Not dramatically, not on deep stains, but for the kind of surface yellowing that accumulates with coffee and tea. A weekly strawberry treatment genuinely made a visible difference. The key was rinsing thoroughly afterward, because the sugar in the berry isn't something you want sitting against enamel. The smile care of the 1950s extended to the lips as well as the teeth. Dry, chapped, rough lips undermine any lipstick application. The color catches in the cracks and creates a broken, textured look that no blotting technique can repair. Women who understood this took their lip condition as seriously as they took their complexion. The most reliable lip treatment was the simplest, a little petroleum jelly worked into the lips before bed and on any nights when they felt tight or dry. In colder months, some women also made a habit of gently exfoliating the lips weekly. A soft toothbrush, or simply a finger with a little sugar mixed with oil, worked in small circles to lift the dead skin. This sounds fussy, it's actually just practical. Smooth lips hold color longer and more evenly than rough ones. Women who had deeply pigmented lipstick stain remaining at the end of the day, particularly after wearing a bright red, would sometimes rub a slice of cucumber or a piece of raw tomato over their lips before cleansing to lift the stain naturally. The mild acids in both vegetables help break down the dye, without the harsh scrubbing that would have irritated already worked skin. Now let's talk about weight, because this is a subject the 1950s approached with its own very specific set of ideas, and some of those ideas are genuinely interesting while others are genuinely alarming, and the full picture deserves to be painted honestly. The ideal female figure of the 1950s was not the stick-thin ideal that came to dominate fashion from the 1960s onward. It was softer, rounder, more deliberately curved. Marilyn Monroe, who became the decade's defining beauty icon, wore a size 12 by modern measurements. The hourglass silhouette, defined waist, full bust, full hip, was what fashion designers like Christian Dior, who launched his influential new look in 1947 and watched it shape the entire decade that followed, were designing for and around. But the full bust and full hip meant nothing without the defined waist, and achieving the defined waist, for women who did not naturally possess one, was a project that occupied a significant portion of their daily lives. The most obvious tool was the girdle, and we have touched on girdles already in the Victorian context from the other scripts in this archive, but the 1950s girdle was a somewhat different beast from its predecessor, the corset. It was not boned in the traditional sense. It was constructed of elasticized materials. The earliest forms of spandex and other synthetic stretch fibers were entering the market in exactly this decade that compressed the flesh of the hips, abdomen and upper thighs into a smoother, more contained shape without the rigid structure that had made corsets so restrictive. Women wore girdles the way women today wear shapewear, as a normal undergarment, not as a special occasion item. A woman who appeared in public without a girdle would have been understood as having let herself go in a way that was considered genuinely embarrassing. This sounds harsh, and by modern standards it is. The social pressure around female body shape in the 1950s was relentless and specific. and left little room for the natural variation of actual human bodies. And yet, and this is the part that gets complicated, some of the exercise and diet strategies women developed in response to that pressure were genuinely effective, sensible, and rooted in an understanding of the body that holds up quite well. Calisthenics at home were common, not the aerobics class, high-energy sweat session version that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. The 1950s version was quieter, more precise, more focused on specific problem areas as the era understood them. Women followed exercise guides published in women's magazines. Good Housekeeping and McCall's and Ladies' Home Journal all ran regular exercise features that prescribed small sets of targeted movements to be performed in the morning before dressing, usually in a matter of 15 or 20 minutes. Leg raises done lying on the floor, waist circles and side bends standing up, a modified form of the exercise now called the bridge, lying on your back, knees bent, lifting and lowering the hips, for the posterior and lower back. Simple sustained movements performed with control rather than speed, which is actually the approach that produces real change in the body's shape over time. Women also walked more than most people today, not power walking in athletic shoes, just walking, to the shops, to the beauty parlor, to a neighbor's house, to the bus stop that was 3 streets over. The daily physical movement built into the texture of ordinary life in the 1950s, before cars became completely dominant and before suburban design began to make walking not just inconvenient but actually structurally impossible, was significant. It wasn't exercise in the intentional sense, it was just life, and it kept bodies in a different state of equilibrium than the sedentary, car-dependent, desk-bound lives that followed. Diet in the 1950s was shaped by the practical constraints of what was available and affordable as much as by any theory of nutrition. Fresh vegetables were seasonal and local in a way they haven't been since the wide deployment of industrial agriculture and long-distance refrigerated shipping. Processed foods were entering the market but hadn't yet achieved the overwhelming dominance they would assume in subsequent decades. Families ate meals that were cooked from reasonably real ingredients because that was what was there. The portion sizes of the era were notably smaller than what we now consider standard. A chicken breast in the 1950s was the chicken breast of a naturally raised, free-ranging bird, smaller, firmer, less water-injected than the commodity product that began to dominate the market in the 1970s and after. The restaurant culture of the decade had not yet undergone the supersizing that began in the 1970s and reached its full expression by the early 2000s. You ate a reasonable amount of real food, and that was enough. Women who were actively concerned about their weight, and many were, because the social pressure was real, used several strategies that modern nutritionists would consider at least partially sound. Drinking a full glass of water before each meal was common practice, understood intuitively as a way of reducing appetite at the table. This is supported by research. Stomach volume is real, and filling part of it with water before introducing food does measurably reduce the amount eaten. Eating slowly was another practice that was consciously taught and consciously practiced. The idea was not to gobble food and then discover you'd had too much. You took smaller bites, you chewed thoroughly, you set your fork down between bites. The physiological basis for this advice, that the satiety signal takes approximately 20 minutes to travel from the stomach to the brain, meaning that if you eat too quickly you'll consume more than you need before the signal catches up, was not widely understood in the 1950s, but the practical wisdom that eating slowly prevented overeating was already part of the culture's common knowledge. Portions were controlled by the structure of the meal itself, a plate, arranged, served and consumed, not grazing, not eating from containers in front of a refrigerator or a television. The ritual of sitting down to a meal at a table, with a plate and utensils and other people, creates natural pauses and social friction that slow the rate of consumption in ways that eating alone, informally, without structure, simply doesn't. Some women followed specific dietary guides published in the era's women's magazines. These guides ranged from the eminently sensible, reduce sugar, increase vegetables, eat protein at each meal, to the frankly eccentric, like the grapefruit diets and milk and banana diets that various wellness entrepreneurs of the decade promoted. The eccentric ones produced the same results then that crash diets produce now, short-term water weight loss followed by regain, leaving the dieter both no better off and somewhat confused about why her body had betrayed her. The women who actually maintained their figures across the decade without the cyclical misery of crash dieting were, by and large, the ones who treated food as fuel and pleasure in roughly equal measure, kept portions reasonable, moved their bodies daily as a matter of ordinary life rather than as a dedicated exercise session, and didn't think about it more than they needed to. Which sounds simple, and is in fact simple, though not always easy. Now let's talk about something that ran through all of these practices and bound them together in a way that makes them feel less like a collection of tricks and more like a coherent philosophy, the idea that consistency is the whole thing. The women of the 1950s who looked remarkable at 60, who had skin that had aged gracefully and hair that was still manageable and posture that still commanded attention, were not the women who had occasionally done something clever for their skin or their bodies. They were the women who had done the same reasonable things, reliably, every day for decades. Cold cream every night, a glass of water every morning, a daily walk, a once-weekly hair wash with the right technique and a good condition treatment. Lipstick that was properly applied and carefully removed at bedtime. Small, sustainable habits built into the structure of daily life so completely that they didn't feel like discipline, they just felt like Tuesday. This is actually the deepest beauty secret of the 1950s, and it's the one we've most completely lost in the era of viral skincare routines and 37-step regimens and the perpetual search for the one miracle product that will change everything. There is no one miracle product. There is never a one miracle product. What creates lasting physical maintenance is not the impressive occasional gesture, but the unremarkable daily one. The women who knew this and lived by it looked 10 years younger than their age at 60 because they had been quietly investing in their own faces and bodies for 30 years, and compound interest applies to physical care the same way it applies to money. Speaking of daily rituals, let's talk about sleep, because the 1950s had specific ideas about sleep and its relationship to beauty that we have since both confirmed and forgotten. Beauty sleep is not a metaphor. It was understood in the 1950s, and it is confirmed by sleep research today, that the hours between roughly 10 at night and 2 in the morning are when the body's repair processes run at their highest intensity. Cells divide more rapidly during deep sleep. Growth hormone is released in its largest pulse of the day. The immune system does its most concentrated work. And the skin, which is an organ, the body's largest organ, a living, breathing piece of biological machinery, undergoes repair processes during sleep that are simply not available during waking hours. Women who consistently got 8 hours and went to bed before 11 had measurably better skin texture, faster healing from blemishes, and more stable hormonal patterns, which matters for skin because many of the most disruptive skin conditions, including adult acne and hormonally triggered breakouts, are regulated at least partially by the same hormonal rhythms that sleep either supports or disrupts. The nighttime skincare routine was taken seriously as the most important beauty moment of the day, more important even than the morning routine, because the morning routine was preparation and the nighttime routine was treatment. Whatever you applied to your face at night had 8 full hours to do its work uninterrupted. This is why cold cream was a nighttime product as much as a morning one, and why women who could afford it would add a slightly richer night cream, something with lanolin perhaps, or with oil of almonds or wheat germ oil, to their nighttime faces on top of the cleansing routine. Sleeping on your back rather than on your side was advice that circulated in women's magazines throughout the decade, and the reason given was specific. Side sleeping creates compression creases on the side of the face that over years of nightly repetition can become permanent. This is true. Dermatologists today call these sleep wrinkles, and they appear specifically on the sides and lower half of the face on whichever side a person habitually sleeps. The women who slept on their backs consistently and avoided pressing their faces into pillows for 8 hours every night did preserve the skin of their faces in a way that was genuinely visible by the time they reached their 50s and 60s. The hair was protected at night as well. Pin curls and rollers we've already discussed, but even women who wore their hair in a simple style would tie a silk or satin scarf around their hair before sleeping. Silk and satin don't create the friction that cotton pillowcases do. They allow the hair to glide rather than catch, which means less breakage at the surface of each hair shaft and less frizz in the morning. Women with processed or dyed hair, which was already in a more fragile state than virgin hair, were particularly religious about their silk scarves. The difference between waking up with your set intact and having to redo half of it from scratch was entirely determined by what your hair had been resting against while you slept. Pillowcase care was also considered. Women changed their pillowcases more frequently than other linens, understanding, without knowing the dermatological term for it, that the oils, residual products, and dead skin cells that accumulate on a pillowcase over a week of nightly contact with the face create an environment that is not ideal for the skin pressed against it for 8 hours every night. Changing the pillowcase every 2 or 3 days, or at minimum every week, was considered basic hygiene rather than anything special. Now let's go further into the age management practices that women developed in this decade, because this is where things get genuinely fascinating. The 1950s were the beginning of the modern anti-aging conversation in America, and the ideas circulating at the time were a mixture of inherited folk wisdom, the emerging science of dermatology and endocrinology, and the beginning of the organized cosmetics industry's interest in marketing products specifically toward concerns about aging. Into this mixture, women brought their own experimentation, their own observations, and the shared knowledge of the women around them. Facial exercises were popular in the early part of the decade, and are experiencing a modest revival today under the name face yoga. The theory in the 1950s was the same as the theory now. The face is covered in small muscles, and like all muscles, they can be exercised to maintain their tone. A sagging jaw or a deep nasolabial fold is partly a matter of lost volume, but it's also partly a matter of muscle tone, and there are specific exercises, an exaggerated chewing motion, a wide smile followed by a tight pucker repeated in sets, pressing the tongue to the roof of the mouth and holding, that target specific areas. Whether these exercises produce dramatic, visible results has been debated by dermatologists for decades. The most recent research suggests that they do produce some effect, particularly in the cheeks and jawline, if practiced consistently over many months. But the women of the 1950s weren't waiting for the research. They were standing in front of their bathroom mirrors at 7 in the morning, making faces at themselves, because a friend or a magazine or their mother had told them it helped. And when they looked at the friend or the mother, they could see that something was working. Massaging the face was another regular practice. Done with cold cream or a little olive oil, a gentle upward massage of the cheekbones and jaw was understood to improve circulation and therefore to bring more blood and oxygen to the surface of the skin, producing the glow that the decade associated with health and youth. This is correct. Increased local circulation does temporarily improve the skin's appearance, and regular massage has been shown to improve lymphatic drainage, reducing puffiness, particularly around the eyes and under the jaw, in ways that are visible. The eye area received particular attention because it shows age earliest and most dramatically. The skin around the eye is the thinnest skin on the face, with almost no sebaceous glands of its own, which means it both absorbs products poorly and ages more quickly than the rest of the face. Women who understood this kept a dedicated eye cream, heavier and oilier than their face moisturizer, and applied it very gently to the orbital bone around the eye using the ring finger, which applies the least pressure. The ring finger technique is not arbitrary. It comes from the understanding that the skin around the eye is fragile, and that dragging or pulling at it accelerates the breakdown of the collagen and elastin fibers that keep it taut. The ring finger, being the weakest finger on the hand, naturally applies less pressure than the index or middle finger. Women who learned this applied it instinctively and without needing to understand why, because someone wiser had simply told them, always use your ring finger. Around the eye, always use your ring finger. For puffiness specifically, women had a range of practical solutions. Cold spoons from the freezer pressed against the eye area for a few minutes in the morning. Cooled chamomile tea bags laid over closed eyes and left for 10 minutes. A slice of cool cucumber over each eye. The cliché image that has its roots in genuine and historically documented practice. All of these use cold temperature and mild anti-inflammatory properties to reduce the swelling that tends to collect under the eyes during sleep and worsen with age. The dark circles that often accompany under-eye puffiness were addressed partly with concealer and partly through prevention. Women who found their circles darkening noticed, often without being told, that they were darker when they'd slept poorly, darker when they'd eaten salty food the night before, darker during their menstrual cycles. They adjusted accordingly, an extra hour of sleep when possible, less salt, more water, extra cold treatment on the mornings when the circles were particularly pronounced. Concealer in the 1950s was usually a shade lighter than the foundation, applied after foundation and set with a tiny puff of loose powder. The technique was to tap it gently into the under-eye area rather than rubbing it. Rubbing disturbs the fine skin and ends up removing the product you just applied, and to blend the edges so it didn't create a visible line where the concealer ended and the regular foundation began. For older women in the decade, women in their 40s and 50s who were working with skin that had already acquired its history of sun and wind and expressions, the practices were similar, but the stakes were understood differently. These were women who had lived through the Depression, through the war, through decades of outdoor work and limited access to beauty products and the specific kind of stress that simply accumulates in a face over years of life. They could not erase what was there. They were not trying to erase it. They were trying to work with it, to present their faces as well as their faces could be presented at whatever point in the journey they were. There was a wisdom in this that I find genuinely moving. The beauty practices of older women in the 1950s were not desperate. They were not trying to pass for 30. They were trying to look like the best version of themselves at the age they actually were, and they brought to that goal the same calm, systematic energy they brought to everything else. Heavier foundation was not the answer. Older skin needs lighter coverage, not heavier, because heavy products settle into lines and creases and make them more visible rather than less. Women who understood this, and many did, through trial and long experience, chose sheer, liquid foundations applied with a light hand, or used no foundation at all and relied on a good tinted moisturizer, though that product wasn't called a tinted moisturizer yet. The lips of older women in the decade trended towards softer, less punishingly precise lines, not because they'd given up on their lipstick, never that, but because they'd learned that an extremely sharp, high-contrast lip line in a bold red tends to migrate and bleed on skin with more established lines around the mouth, and the effect is worse than a slightly softer approach. Coral and rose shades, which carry less blue undertone than true reds and sit more naturally against aging skin, were favored by women who had the experience to know better. Now let's talk about something that sits between beauty and health, but belongs firmly in this conversation: the relationship of the 1950s woman to sunlight. This is a case where the decade was, by modern standards, catastrophically wrong, and it's worth being honest about it even in the context of celebrating what they got right. The connection between sun exposure and skin aging was not yet understood in the popular consciousness of the 1950s. The role of ultraviolet radiation in accelerating the breakdown of collagen and elastin, in creating the spotted, leathery, lined texture of sun-damaged skin, in dramatically increasing the risk of skin cancers. This knowledge was only beginning to emerge in the medical literature and had not yet made its way into everyday awareness. Women who spent summers in the backyard in short sleeves, women who used their free time to lie in the sun with the specific goal of acquiring a tan, were not doing something they understood to be damaging. They thought they were healthy. The irony is that many of the women who had the most beautiful skin in late middle age and old age in that decade were women who had avoided sun exposure not for any conscious skin protective reason, but simply because the practical demands of their lives kept them largely indoors, or because fair complexions had gone through periods of being socially preferred and they'd kept themselves out of the sun for that reason, or simply because they'd never been particularly fond of lying around outside. What women did do, practically and correctly for their hands and any exposed arm skin they were concerned about, was apply cold cream or a basic moisturizing lotion before going outside, creating a partial barrier against the drying effects of wind. Some women wore gloves outdoors, not just as a social convention, but because gloves protect the hands from the elements in a very literal, effective way. The hands of women who had worn gloves regularly throughout their adult lives aged dramatically more slowly than the hands of women who hadn't, because the thin skin on the backs of the hands is among the first to show age, and it responds dramatically to protection. The neck was another area that received intentional attention. Women of the decade understood, and you see this in the advice columns of the era's women's magazines, that the neck and décolletage age at the same rate as the face and show the effects of neglect equally clearly. Whatever went on the face went on the neck. The same cold cream, the the same upward massage strokes, starting at the collarbone and working upward, the same translucent powder if the woman was wearing a low enough neckline that her neck would be visible. The neck was not an afterthought. It was part of the presentation. Hands and feet received their own care routines, practiced usually once or twice a week as part of what the decade called beauty maintenance. A home manicure involved softening the cuticles in warm soapy water, pushing them back gently with a wooden orange stick, never cutting because cut cuticles bleed and invite infection, buffing the nail surface to a light sheen with a chamois buffer, and then applying a base coat, 2 coats of color, and a top coat with careful drying time between each layer. The home manicure technique of the 1950s produced results that lasted longer than most modern manicures, and the reason is simply the careful layering and the proper drying time. Women understood that rushing any step of the process meant repainting within days. Patience was built into the ritual because the alternative, chipped polish on a well-dressed woman, was considered slovenly in a way that the era's social standards simply didn't accommodate. Red nails were the era's signature, matching the lipstick in both color family and philosophical commitment to the idea that a woman's presentation should be coherent, intentional, and complete. A woman with a bright red lip and pale nails looked unfinished by the standards of 1952, in the same way that a carefully set hair and a wrinkled dress looked unfinished, not catastrophically wrong, but as if something had been forgotten. Nail care extended to the prevention of problems as well as the correction of them. Women who worked with their hands, and despite the domestic ideal of the era, most women did, whether in the home or in jobs that required manual labor, used hand cream with the same regularity they used face moisturizer, because chapped, cracked hands were both painful and inconsistent with the standard they were trying to maintain. Jergens lotion was as likely to be found at the kitchen sink as in the bathroom, and it was used not after every washing, but certainly after any washing that involved hot water or strong detergent. Now the beauty parlor deserves its own extended visit, because it was not just a place where beauty happened, it was a place where women's culture happened, where information moved and bonds were formed, and the collective knowledge of feminine self-care was shared, debated, updated, and preserved. The beauty parlor operator of the 1950s was a skilled professional in a way that's easy to underestimate from a modern distance. She understood hair chemistry without formal training, through apprenticeship and practice, and the kind of accumulated knowledge that comes from having your hands in someone else's hair every working day for 15 years. She knew which client's hair was too fragile for a permanent wave without being told, because she'd been watching it for years and knew its individual texture and history. She knew which colors would fade poorly on which hair types. She knew which styles required more upkeep than a particular client would realistically provide, and would gently redirect towards something more manageable without making the client feel bad about her limitations. She also knew everything. In the beauty parlor, under the dome of the dryer hood, with the warm air humming and the distant sound of water running in the shampoo bowls, women talked. They talked about their marriages and their children and their neighbors and their health worries and their money troubles and the dreams they still carried quietly alongside all the practical weight of their everyday lives. The beauty parlor operator heard all of it, remembered most of it, connected the pieces in ways that made her a de facto community counselor long before that phrase meant anything. There is a kind of care in that, in providing a physical space where women could sit under their dryers and be both attended to and heard, that is not usually credited to the beauty industry when we talk about its cultural significance. The beauty parlor of the 1950s was providing something that is now served by therapists and life coaches and wellness retreats, and it was providing it for the price of a shampoo and set once a week in a pink vinyl chair on a Tuesday morning. Let's talk about fragrance, because scent was an important part of the 1950s woman's presentation, and the practices around it were specific. A woman did not put perfume on her skin at the pulse points as one continuous gesture. She layered fragrance the way she layered her face, starting with a base, building toward a final impression. The layering started in the bath or shower. Scented soap, a matching or complementary talcum powder applied to the body while the skin was still warm from the bath, locking in a faint base of fragrance before any perfume was applied. The talcum powder step is worth pausing on, because it served purposes beyond fragrance. Applied to the body after bathing, talcum powder absorbs surface moisture and creates a smooth, dry surface on the skin that reduces friction in areas where skin meets skin, inner thighs, underarms, beneath the bust, and prevents the discomfort that leads to irritation. In an era before modern moisture-wicking fabrics, when women wore full cotton slips under heavy skirts and spent their days doing physical work, the practical value of talcum powder was considerable. Perfume itself was applied sparingly and strategically, a small amount to the inside of the wrists, a touch to the pulse points on the neck, behind the ear, at the collarbone, at the hollow of the throat. Women who wanted the fragrance to travel upward as the day warmed, carrying up to meet people at face level rather than dissipating toward the floor, sometimes applied it to the back of the knees or the inner elbow. Pulse points generate heat, and heat diffuses fragrance. This is simple physics, and women who understood it produced a cloud of scent around themselves that didn't announce their presence from across the room, but materialized at exactly the right moment in any close encounter. The fragrances of the era leaned toward the floral and the powdery. Chanel No. 5, which had been introduced in 1921 but was still the defining scent of feminine sophistication. Arpège by L'Envie, White Shoulders, Evening in Paris, which was widely available in its distinctive blue bottle at dime stores and drugstores, and carried no less care in application for its modest price. The perfume a woman wore was understood to be as much a signature as her handwriting, and changing it was a significant decision. Home fragrance was also managed deliberately. Sachets, small cloth bags filled with dried lavender, rose petals, or cedar chips, were placed in lingerie drawers and linen closets so that every garment emerged gently scented. Women who made their own sachets, dried their own lavender, or purchased dried flowers and herbs from the market. The result was subtle, not an aggressive perfume, but a faint sweetness that clung to the fabric and lingered pleasantly when the clothing was warmed by the body. These sachets also served a practical purpose. Cedar repels moths. Lavender has some antimicrobial properties and is believed to repel certain insects. In an era before modern synthetic pest control was universal, the sachets in the closet were doing real protective work alongside the pleasing work of making everything smell lovely. Now let's spend some time with something that the beauty culture of the 1950s handled with remarkable sophistication: the relationship between what you ate and how you looked. Not in the weight management sense we've already discussed, but in the specific, targeted, nutritional cosmetic sense. The connection between diet and skin quality was well understood in the practical, experiential way that women's culture often understands things before science formally demonstrates them. Women knew, because they had watched it happen in themselves and their mothers and their neighbors, that certain foods made skin worse and certain foods made skin better. Drinking lots of water was the most universal advice, and as we've already established, it's correct. Hydrated skin is more elastic, plumper, and more able to repair itself than dehydrated skin. The degree to which oral hydration affects visible skin hydration is nuanced. Much of the water you drink is used by internal organs before it reaches the skin, and the most effective way to keep skin surface hydrated is topical, not oral. But the general practice of drinking adequate water throughout the day supports overall cellular function in ways that do eventually show up in the face. Specific foods were recommended in the magazines and among women as beauty foods, with varying degrees of scientific validity. Carrots were understood to be good for the complexion, and they contain beta-carotene, which the body converts to vitamin A, which plays a genuine role in skin cell turnover and repair. Women who ate carrots regularly often had a very slightly warm, golden tone to their complexions, which they and others around them interpreted as healthy and vibrant. Leafy green vegetables were prized for their iron content, and iron deficiency does produce visible effects in the face: pallor, dark circles under the eyes, a general dullness that the most expensive skincare cannot fully address because it's coming from inside. Women who made sure their diets included regular servings of spinach and kale and the other dark leafy greens were investing in their complexions without knowing the biochemistry behind it. Liver was a regular feature of the 1950s diet in a way it isn't in contemporary cooking, and the beauty-adjacent reason was the same as the medical one. Liver is extraordinarily dense in B vitamins, particularly B12, and in vitamin A, and both of these nutrients support skin health, nerve function, and the general metabolic processes that keep the body working efficiently. It tastes the way it tastes, and the modern world has largely decided that's not worth the nutritional benefits. But the women who ate it weekly were getting something genuinely valuable: olive oil, which was in wider culinary use in Italian-American communities than in mainstream American cooking of the era, was understood by the women who cooked with it to be beneficial not just as a food but as a beauty ingredient. They used it on their skin, in their hair, and on their nails. Applied to the cuticles in small amounts and left overnight, olive oil softens and conditions in a way that even expensive cuticle treatments can struggle to match. The same oil massaged into the scalp before shampooing acts as a deep conditioning treatment. Applied, left for 30 minutes to an hour, and then washed out. The women who grew up in Mediterranean culinary traditions and brought those traditions with them into their American households in the post-war decade had been using olive oil in their beauty routines for generations, and they looked it. The skin of southern Italian women in their 70s and 80s who had eaten olive oil every day of their lives and who had massaged it into their skin and hair since childhood was a walking advertisement for the Mediterranean dietary tradition long before anyone was calling it the Mediterranean diet. There is also the matter of sleep, which we've touched on, and stress, which deserves its own acknowledgement. Women in the 1950s did not have the vocabulary of cortisol and stress hormones and the HPA axis, but they understood, from observation, that worry showed in the face, that a period of particular anxiety produced breakouts or dullness or puffiness in women who were otherwise well maintained, that sleep deprivation created circles that no amount of concealer would entirely fix. The response was partly practical: take care of your body, maintain your sleep, eat reasonably, and partly the specific kind of deliberately cultivated equanimity that the era valued as part of femininity. Women were expected not to show stress. The maintenance of a calm, pleasant exterior, regardless of what was happening internally, was a social requirement that the decade enforced firmly. This was, in many respects, unjust and limiting. But the practical effect of the practice, of consciously cultivating a composed demeanor, of not allowing anxiety to express itself visibly, of finding the genuine calm that comes from physical maintenance and routine, did produce something in the faces of women who practiced it faithfully. Not a frozen, artificial calm, something more like the natural ease that comes from knowing you have a system and trusting it. This is the thing about the 1950s beauty routine that is most difficult to translate into the current moment. It was not a performance of confidence. It was the actual foundation of confidence. When you know your hair is set and your face is finished and your clothes are pressed and your home is managed and you have done what you know how to do, when you have held up your end of the bargain you made with yourself, there is a kind of quiet, inner steadiness that shows up in the face and in the way you carry yourself. It is not smugness, it is not vanity, it is the calm that comes from competence. Women in the 1950s who looked beautiful in the truest sense, not just technically correct, but genuinely, warmly, presently beautiful, almost uniformly carried this quality. You saw it in the way they held their shoulders, in the easy directness of their gaze, in the absence of that particular kind of self-consciousness that comes from not being sure whether you look all right. They knew they looked all right. They had made sure of it, with 1,000 small deliberate acts performed daily for years, and the accumulated result was a kind of ease that no single product could have produced. Let's talk about the dressing ritual and the relationship between clothing and the body, because the way women dressed in the 1950s was itself a beauty practice in a sense that goes beyond the obvious. The clothes of the decade were structured in a way that required the body inside them to be equally structured. The new look silhouette that Dior introduced and that dominated the decade demanded a fitted bodice, a defined waist, and a full skirt that fell below the knee. This shape required a girdle, a good brassiere, a full slip to protect both the outer garment and the wearer's modesty, and usually a petticoat to give the skirt its volume. Getting dressed was not a 2-minute event, it was a sequence. Women who dressed this way every day, and in the early and middle 1950s, most women did, because the alternative was being visibly out of step with the era's standard, developed the automatic, efficient sequencing of dressing that comes from long practice. The girdle went on first, then the brassiere, then the slip, then the dress, then any additional layers, then the shoes, each garment in its proper order, each step completed before moving to the next, nothing rushed or half done. The physical discipline of wearing these clothes produced physical changes in the body over time, not because the corset or girdle was doing the work of controlling the body, though it was doing some of that, but because women who dressed this way were continuously conscious of their posture. A structured dress worn with a girdle requires upright posture to look correct. The clothes are doing some of the work of holding the shape, but the body is also doing work, and that work, the engagement of the core muscles required to stand up straight in clothes designed for a woman who stands up straight, has a real training effect over years. Women of the era who maintained excellent posture into old age often did so in part because the decades of wearing structured clothing had trained their bodies to hold a particular alignment. The muscles that support an upright spine were chronically engaged rather than chronically neglected, and the physical benefit of this was visible in the bearing of older women who had dressed formally throughout their lives. The shoes were uncomfortable. This is a historical fact that cannot be prettied up. Pointed toe heels worn daily throughout an adult life produce specific foot deformities, bunions, hammer toes, the permanent shortening of the Achilles tendon, that are measurable and significant. Women in the 1950s wore these shoes because the standard required them, not because they were good for their feet, and the physical cost of the standard was real. What they did to manage the feet was sensible where it could be. Foot baths, simple warm water, sometimes with a handful of Epsom salts dissolved in it, were a regular weekly practice. Epsom salt, which is magnesium sulfate, reduces swelling and eases muscle soreness. A 15-minute foot soak in Epsom salt water genuinely reduces the inflammation that accumulates in feet that have been in narrow heels all day. Women who did this regularly were not doing it as a pampering ritual in any superficial sense. They were managing a real physical problem with a practical and effective tool. Foot cream applied before sleep, followed by a pair of soft cotton socks worn overnight, was the standard treatment for rough, cracked heels, which were almost universal among women wearing hard leather shoes daily. The cream softened the heel overnight. The socks kept the cream in contact with the skin and prevented it from transferring to the sheets. In the morning, a pumice stone over the heel area removed whatever loosened skin the cream had softened. Done consistently, this regimen produces heels that are genuinely smooth, genuinely without the painful cracking that comes from the combination of hard shoes and neglected skin. Now let's come back to the face for one more conversation, because there's a whole chapter of 1950s beauty practice we haven't yet visited, the homemade facial mask. The beauty mask was not an invention of the 1950s. Women had been applying various substances to their faces in the name of beauty since antiquity, but the 1950s housewife brought to the tradition her era's particular combination of practical resourcefulness, born from the Depression and the wartime rationing that had preceded the decade, and the organizational discipline of someone who ran a household on a budget and could not afford to buy something she could easily make. The most classic homemade mask was an egg white mask. An egg white, beaten lightly with a fork until frothy and then applied to the face with the fingers or a pastry brush, creates a film as it dries that visibly tightens the skin's surface. You can feel it happening, the gentle progressive tightening as the egg white dries over 10 or 15 minutes. When rinsed with warm water, it leaves the face looking smoother, tighter, with more even coloring than before. The mechanism is partly the tightening film effect, which is temporary but real, and partly the protein content of the egg white, which does provide some structural support to the surface layer of the skin. The effect lasts for hours rather than days, but for a woman who wanted her skin to look its best for a specific occasion, a dinner party, a photograph, an event, the egg white mask applied an hour before dressing was a genuinely useful tool. Honey masks were used for their moisturizing and antimicrobial properties. Raw honey, not the processed, filtered honey in the squeeze bottle, but the raw, thick, granular kind bought from a farmer or a specialty shop, contains hydrogen peroxide in trace amounts, which gives it mild antiseptic properties, and it has a molecular structure that allows it to bind water and hold it against the skin. Applied to the face for 15 minutes, rinsed off with warm water, it leaves the skin soft and slightly glowing in a way that's particularly useful for dry skin in winter. Oatmeal masks, ground oats mixed with a little warm water or milk into a paste and applied to the face for 20 minutes, were used for sensitive or irritated skin, and with good reason. Oat flour contains compounds called avenanthramides, which are potent anti-inflammatory agents. The use of oatmeal preparations for irritated skin is so well established that modern dermatologists use oatmeal-based preparations to treat eczema and other inflammatory skin conditions. The 1950s housewife applying her oatmeal paste to a face that had gotten a little too much sun or was reacting to a new product was using the same underlying chemistry without knowing the names. Cucumber slices laid over closed eyes for 20 minutes was the treatment most associated in the popular imagination with feminine beauty rituals of the era, and it was used because it worked, not just because it looked charming. Cucumber contains ascorbic acid and caffeic acid, both of which reduce water retention and reduce swelling. Cold cucumber against warm, puffy morning eyes reduces the swelling that gathers there overnight. Women who did this on mornings when they had slept poorly or had cried the night before, or were simply running a little more inflamed than usual, went out looking more rested than they actually were. The avocado mask, richer and more emollient than most of the others, was used by women with very dry or mature skin. Half an avocado mashed and applied to the face for 20 minutes, then rinsed, leaves a film of oils, oleic acid primarily, which is deeply moisturizing, that makes the skin feel softer immediately and provides genuine hydration in the hours following treatment. This was not a cheap option in the 1950s. Avocados were less widely available and more expensive than they are today, but women who could access them used them. The clay mask was also practiced at home, using fuller's earth, a type of absorbent clay that had been used in beauty preparations since the 19th century, mixed with water or rosewater into a paste. Clay masks draw oil and impurities from the pores as they dry, a process that is more effective on oily skin types and somewhat less useful on dry ones. Women with oilier complexions, who struggled with the enlarged pores and the slight shine that were considered imperfections by the era's beauty standards, used clay masks weekly to manage what they couldn't fully control through cleansing alone. Rosewater, which appeared in several of these formulations, deserves its own note. Distilled from rose petals, rosewater has a mild astringent effect and a beautiful, distinctive fragrance. It has been used in beauty preparations since ancient times, and in the 1950s it was available in most pharmacies in small bottles at modest cost. Women used it as a facial toner on its own, as the liquid component of homemade masks, and as a fragrant mist sprayed lightly over a finished face to set powder and add a dewy quality. The misting of a finished face to set makeup is a technique that has been rediscovered several times in the beauty industry since, usually under some new name with considerable marketing investment behind it. Women in the 1950s were doing it with a small spray bottle of rosewater and a deft hand, and the result was the same: powder that doesn't look powdery, color that looks less flat and more natural, an overall finish that suggests healthy skin rather than a face that has been painted. The beauty culture of the 1950s was not perfect. It operated within social constraints that we have rightly moved away from: the pressure to maintain an ideal appearance as a condition of social acceptance, the narrowness of the beauty standard it enforced, the physical discomfort it regularly asked women to bear as a matter of course. These are real criticisms and they deserve to be acknowledged. But within those constraints, the women of the decade developed and practiced and passed along a body of practical knowledge about physical self-care that is genuinely worth knowing, not because we should go back, we shouldn't and we can't, but because the principles underneath the specific practices are as sound today as they were in 1952, and because there is something worth honoring in the quiet daily intelligence of ordinary women who made themselves remarkable without anyone calling it remarkable, because that was simply what you did. Let's spend some time now with one of the most interesting aspects of 1950s beauty, the approach to aging gracefully. Because the women of that decade had very specific ideas about what aging well looked like, and those ideas were different from both the youth obsession that came after and the resigned acceptance that was sometimes falsely attributed to earlier generations. The woman of the 1950s who was moving through her 40s and 50s was not trying to look 25. She was not engaged in the project of denial. She was engaged in the project of presentation, of presenting the best possible version of herself at the age she actually was, with the understanding that aging well required maintenance, and the further understanding that maintenance was a form of self-respect rather than vanity. There is a phrase that circulated in the beauty advice of the era. After 40, a woman has to choose between her face and her figure. The idea was that the padding of the cheeks and the softness under the jaw, the roundness that comes with a slightly higher body weight in middle age, actually preserves the face better than thinness does. Thin women in their 50s often looked gaunt and lined in a way that their slightly fuller counterparts did not, because the subcutaneous fat that comes with a body weight slightly above ideal provides a natural plumping effect that no injectable filler was available to provide in the 1950s. Women who had maintained very lean figures through their 30s and early 40s sometimes found that the face they'd wanted, angular, defined, high cheekboned, revealed its costs at 50 when the natural volume loss that comes with aging combined with the already thin subcutaneous fat to produce a look of severity or hollowness that they hadn't intended and couldn't easily correct. Whereas women who had lived comfortably at a weight slightly above the era's ideal found their faces looked rounder and softer and somehow more youthful at 50 than the women who had dieted their way to the ideal figure for 30 years. This is not an argument for any particular body weight. It's an observation about how the face and body interact as they age, and the women of the 1950s who noticed it and acted on it were noticing something real. For the hair of aging women, the approach was equally pragmatic. Grey hair in the 1950s was handled in two main ways: concealed or embraced. Women who concealed it used the home or salon dyeing products of the era, which were cruder than modern formulations but effective. The dominant shades were a range of brunettes and auburn reds. The era was less confident about blonde dyeing, which was technically more difficult to achieve convincingly, and true platinum blonde required bleaching processes that were genuinely damaging to the hair in ways that less experienced operators couldn't always manage safely. Women who embraced grey hair, and many did, particularly in the later 1950s as styles began to soften slightly, found that the texture and volume of naturally grey hair was sometimes better than it had been in the years before it turned. Grey hair has a coarser texture and often more body than pigmented hair, which means it holds a set differently, often with less product required. Women who had struggled their whole lives with fine, limp hair sometimes discovered in their 40s and 50s that the grey growth was actually easier to style than what it was replacing. The specific styling considerations for grey hair were different from those for pigmented hair. Grey hair shows yellow tones easily, particularly when the hair has been exposed to hard water, to cigarette smoke, or to the chlorine of swimming pools. Women who wanted to keep their grey hair bright and cool-toned, rather than yellowish, used a weekly rinse of blue rinse or lavender rinse, mildly pigmented products designed to neutralize warm yellow undertones and restore the cool silver quality they wanted. The chemistry behind this is the same as modern purple shampoos. Blue and purple tones counteract yellow on the color wheel, and a very mild deposit of blue or purple pigment over yellowish grey hair corrects the color without dramatically changing it. The 1950s woman also understood her face differently after 40 and adjusted her makeup accordingly. The exaggerated high arch of the fashionable brow was moderated. A slightly flatter, more natural arch worked better with a face that had acquired character in its own right and no longer needed the dramatic geometry of the very young woman's constructed brow. The eyeshadow application stayed on the simpler side, avoiding anything that emphasized creasing by accumulating in the natural crease of the eyelid. Powder application on mature skin was done with a lighter hand, because powder sits differently on skin that has lost some of its natural plumpness. It can look dry and cakey rather than matte if applied too heavily, emphasizing texture rather than smoothing it. Women who had been powdering generously since their 20s learnt to reduce the amount used as they moved through their 40s and 50s, maintaining just enough to control shine without creating the chalky effect that too much powder produces on aging skin. The lipstick shade choices shifted subtly. Very dark colours tend to make the mouth look smaller and can add harshness to a face that has acquired its own strong features through age. Very pale colours look washed out and slightly unwell against the warmer, more complex colouring of mature skin. The sweet spot for most women moving through middle age in the 1950s was in the warm pinks, the soft berries, the corals that added colour without drama, shades that worked with the skin tone rather than against it. The overall approach to dressing, beauty and presentation in these years was calibrated toward the fact of who you were, a woman with history, with knowledge, with children perhaps grown or nearly grown, with a face that had recorded everything you'd been through and had the texture to show it. The goal was not to hide that face, but to wear it well. There was a specific quality in the faces of older women in the 1950s who had maintained their beauty practices faithfully across the decades, a quality of settled authority, of easy comfort in their own presentation that is quite different from anything a young woman can produce simply by applying the same products and techniques. It comes from repetition, from the 1,000 mornings of practice, from knowing without having to think about it which colours suit you and which don't, which techniques work on your particular face and which don't, what your hair will do and what it won't, what your skin needs in winter versus summer, what a full night of sleep does for you versus 6 hours. This is accumulated expertise, and it is beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with any product or technique and everything to do with time. The beauty parlor visit for older women in the decade was even more important socially than for younger women because it provided a structured weekly occasion for the kind of conversation and connection that might otherwise be harder to maintain as children left home and the social infrastructure of the school years disappeared. A woman in her 50s in the 1950s who went to the same beauty parlor every Tuesday morning for 20 years was woven into a social fabric that sustained her in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to recognize. The operator who had been setting her hair for 2 decades knew her face as well as any doctor. She knew which way the widow's peak grew and which direction the curl wanted to go, and that the right side of the head always processed a chemical treatment slightly differently than the left. She knew that a difficult week showed up in the tension around the jaw, and that a good summer was written in the slight lightening of the hair from natural sun exposure. She knew the whole story. And Joan, our ordinary 1950s woman, sitting in the pink vinyl chair with her hair in rollers and a cup of coffee balanced on the counter beside her and the hood dryer humming overhead, Joan knew she was known, completely and specifically and over a long span of time. In the particular warmth of that knowing, she looked perhaps more beautiful than any routine could have made her. Let us talk for a little while about water. The 1950s woman's relationship with water as a beauty tool went well beyond the morning glass of drinking water and beyond the hair rinsing we've discussed. Water was understood as a primary medium through which the body maintained itself, and the particular rituals women built around water were both sensible and oddly elegant. The warm bath was a beauty practice as much as a hygiene practice, not the quick shower and out of the modern morning routine, but an actual bath, taken at least once a week in many households, and sometimes more frequently, lasting long enough for the water to do its work. The water of a proper 1950s bath was warm, not hot. Women who understood skincare knew that very hot water strips the skin's natural oils in the same way very hot washing strips hair, and that the right temperature was warm enough to open pores and relax muscles, but not so hot as to leave you emerging with red, dry, tight skin. Into the bath water went things, not bubble bath necessarily, though that had its place. Oatmeal tied in a piece of muslin and dropped into the warm water, creating a milky, soothing bath that was particularly useful for women with dry or sensitive skin. A cup of apple cider vinegar added to the bath water to restore the skin's pH and help with any fungal irritation. A few drops of lavender oil for relaxation, not from a specialized essential oil brand, because that industry didn't yet exist in its current form, but from the small bottle of lavender water available at the pharmacy, used primarily as a fragrance but understood to have soothing properties. Epsom salts were added to the bath for muscle ache, as we've already mentioned for the feet, but the full body application was common enough after a week of physical housework or gardening or the particular strain of walking everywhere in heeled shoes. The magnesium in Epsom salts is absorbed through the skin, and magnesium deficiency, which is more common than many people realize, contributes to muscle cramping and general physical fatigue. The weekly Epsom salt bath was, in many cases, providing genuine magnesium supplementation through the skin in the most pleasant possible delivery method. After the bath came the ritual that separated the women who would age beautifully from the women who would wonder why they hadn't. Body lotion applied immediately, while the skin was still warm and the pores were still slightly open from the bath. Not after drying, not after getting dressed. Right out of the bath, after only a brief toweling, the lotion went on. This technique, moisturizing damp skin rather than completely dry skin, dramatically improves the lotion's effectiveness because the moisture trapped under the applied product is the moisture your skin actually needs, and the lotion seals it in rather than having to provide it from scratch. Women who did this automatically, who reached for the lotion bottle as a reflex the moment they stepped out of the bath, had different skin at 60 than women who considered moisturizing optional or who waited until they were already dry and dressed. The difference was not dramatic month to month. Year to year it accumulated into something that was very clearly visible. Cold water rinses after the bath, a brief turn of the tap to cold at the very end, running cold water over the face and neck before stepping out, were understood as an astringent finishing step. The shock of cold causes blood vessels to constrict, temporarily reducing any redness and closing the pores that had opened in the warm water. Women who did this reported that their skin felt tighter and looked more awake for hours after the bath. They were correct. The temporary vascular constriction produces exactly that effect. Now let's step briefly into the kitchen, because the beauty rituals of the 1950s were not confined to the bathroom. The kitchen was a laboratory for women who understood that many of the most effective beauty ingredients were edible, literally because many of them were food. The kitchen remedy for dry, damaged hair that we have already mentioned, the egg treatment, was applied in the kitchen because it required working quickly before the egg warmed to room temperature and the risk of it cooking slightly in very warm water became real. You applied it quickly to dry hair, worked it through with your fingers, covered your head with a shower cap or a warm towel for 30 minutes, and then rinsed it out with cool water, never hot, because hot water cooks egg protein and you absolutely did not want to rinse cooked egg out of your hair. The final rinse of apple cider vinegar removed any egginess from the hair's smell and sealed the cuticle. The kitchen was also where the avocado mask was mashed, where the honey was measured, where the sugar for the lip scrub was combined with a little almond oil or olive oil. Women who kept their kitchen pantries well stocked had everything they needed for a complete beauty routine without ever visiting a beauty counter, and many of them preferred it that way, both for the economy of it and for the particular satisfaction of knowing exactly what they were putting on their skin. The relationship between food and beauty extended to what women specifically avoided eating, or at least limited when they were concerned about their skin. Sugar was understood, not in biochemical terms, but in the experiential terms of having eaten more of it and seeing the effects in the mirror to worsen the skin's clarity. Women who had a few days of eating sweets heavily sometimes noticed a small outbreak of blemishes in the following days, and they connected the two events correctly. The mechanism is glycation, excess sugar molecules binding to collagen and elastin fibers, damaging their structure and increasing the skin's susceptibility to inflammation and breakout. But women in the 1950s didn't know it by that name. They just knew that too much sugar made their skin worse. Dairy had its complicated relationship with skin even then. Some women found that reducing milk and cream in their diets improved the clarity of their complexions. Others noticed no difference at all. The individual variation was as real in 1952 as it is today, and the women who paid enough attention to their bodies to notice the connection and act on it were practicing a form of personalized nutrition that modern wellness culture likes to present as a new idea. Alcohol was another dietary variable that women tracked against their skin's condition. Not because abstinence was the beauty ideal, a glass of wine at dinner was entirely normal in the households that could afford it, but because the specific effects of alcohol on the skin were observable without any medical training. A night of more drinking than usual produced a face that looked visibly puffier and more flushed the next morning, with larger, more visible pores and a generally less composed appearance. Women who wanted to look their best for a particular occasion on a particular day knew to have a quiet night the day before. Let's turn now to the specific art of the 1950s hairstyle in more detail, because there are several specific styles of the decade that deserve their own discussion in terms of how they were achieved and what the daily maintenance of each required. The victory roll, which had been introduced in the 1940s during the war years and lingered into the early 1950s, was a style characterized by two large cylindrical rolls of hair positioned on either side of the crown of the head, sweeping backward. To create this, sections of hair were taken from either side of the part, teased or backcombed very lightly at the root for grip, then wound around a cylindrical former, a hair roller, a finger, a section of the woman's own pinned fingers, and secured with a row of bobby pins along the inner edge of each roll, hidden from view. The remaining hair was either swept up into an elegant chignon at the back or left loose in soft waves below. The victory roll required practice to make symmetrical. The two rolls had to match in size and in the angle at which they angled backward from the face. Women who wore this style regularly could produce it in 10 minutes. Women who wore it occasionally spent 20 minutes and still sometimes ended up with one roll noticeably larger than the other. The poodle cut was a style unique to the very early 1950s, short, tightly permed all over, reminiscent of the fur of its namesake. It was popular specifically because it was low maintenance. You woke up with it in place, or close enough to place, that the morning routine was minimal. Women who lived active lives, or who had more interesting things to do with their mornings than spend them on their hair, found the poodle cut liberating in a way that the elaborate sets of the era's dominant look were not. The bouffant, which grew in volume and ambition throughout the second half of the decade and reached its full exuberance in the early 1960s, began appearing in the late 1950s and required its own specific set of techniques. The foundation of any bouffant was volume at the crown, and volume at the crown required a method called backcombing or teasing, using a fine-toothed comb or a brush to push the hair shaft's cuticle backward toward the root, creating a tangled mass that holds its height rather than lying flat under gravity. Teasing correctly, enough to create genuine height without creating damage that wouldn't brush out cleanly, was a skill. You worked in small sections, holding each section up away from the head, placing the comb about 2/3 of the way down the section, and pushing it toward the root in short, controlled strokes. The teased section was then laid gently on top of the previous one, building upward. A final pass with a soft brush over the smooth outer surface of the style, very carefully so as not to disturb the tease underneath, gave the bouffant its sleek exterior while maintaining the engineered interior structure. Hairspray was the decade's great finishing tool, and the varieties available toward the end of the 1950s were remarkable in their holding power. Applied in a fine mist from a spray can at arm's length from the head, too close and you got wet spots that dried visible and stiff. Hairspray fixed the finished style in place for the day. Women who had their hair set professionally on a Tuesday morning and wanted it to last until Friday, perhaps with only a light freshening of the brush each morning, used hairspray in quantities that would alarm a modern stylist. The result was hair that could survive wind, rain, and a full day of activity without losing its structure. The removal of the week's set was itself a ritual. Warm water, a thorough shampoo to remove the accumulated product and the oils of the week, and then immediately into the next set. The hair was almost never worn completely clean and unstyled, except in the privacy of the bedroom or the beauty parlor basin. Now let us return to the face one final time, because there is a whole thread of 1950s beauty practice we haven't fully explored yet, the ongoing, daily relationship that women maintained with their complexions through the seasons. Winter skincare in the 1950s was different from summer skincare, and women adjusted their routines accordingly. Winter air, particularly inside heated houses where the humidity dropped and the air became dry, pulled moisture from the skin in a way that summer heat and humidity did not. Women who moved through winter without adjusting their routine, who used the same light moisturizer in January they'd used in July, often found their skin dry and flaky by February, with a tight, papery quality around the cheeks and forehead. The winter adjustment was richer products applied more frequently. The cold cream for nighttime cleansing was perhaps followed by a slightly heavier night cream rather than the lighter moisturizer used in summer. An additional application of lotion might be added midday, not to the full face, but to the most vulnerable areas, the nose, the cheeks, the skin around the mouth where dryness showed first and most obviously. Humidification of the home was managed practically. A pot of water set on the radiator or near the heating vent, houseplants which transpire moisture into the air, a wet towel hung near the bedroom door at night. These simple measures increased the humidity of the indoor environment in winter, reducing the rate at which skin surface moisture evaporated. Women who maintained their household humidity through winter had skin that required less intensive moisturizing than women who allowed the interior air to become very dry. Summer brought the opposite challenge. Heat and humidity kept the skin surface moist, but also produced more sebum, more sweat, and more of the surface dirt and bacteria that accumulate on oily skin in warm conditions. The summer adjustment was lighter, a gel cleanser or a thorough cold cream cleansing, a lighter moisturizer, powder applied more freely to control the shine that showed earlier in a warm day than in a cool one. The specific problem of heat rash, the small red prickly bumps that appear on the skin when sweat glands are blocked, was addressed with the practical tools at hand. Calamine lotion, a pale pink suspension of zinc oxide and ferric oxide that most medicine cabinets contained as a standard item, soothed irritated skin and dried out the moisture that was perpetuating the rash. Cornstarch, applied lightly to areas prone to heat rash in the way that talcum powder was applied to the body after bathing, absorbed sweat and reduced friction and kept the skin surface cooler and drier. Women who lived in particularly humid climates, the American South, coastal areas, maintained summer routines with more discipline than women in drier regions because the consequences of letting the routine slip were more visible. Humidity and heat together produce a more oily complexion, more prone to the kind of creasing and migration of makeup that undermined the era's standard of polished presentation, and correcting for that required more frequent powdering, more careful foundation choice, and more disciplined attention to all the steps of the routine. The transition seasons, spring and fall, were handled by gentle, gradual adjustment of the routine rather than an abrupt switch. Women who changed products too suddenly, going from the heavy winter regimen directly to the light summer one, often experienced a period of breakout as the skin adjusted to the shift. Those who had learned this, usually by having done it wrong once and observing the results, made their seasonal adjustments incrementally, a slightly lighter moisturizer, then a slightly lighter still, over several weeks of spring. Let's talk about one more dimension of this beauty culture before we begin to draw toward a close, the social and communal aspect of it, the way beauty knowledge was transmitted between women. In the 1950s, there were no YouTube tutorials, there were no Instagram accounts, there were no online forums where women could ask questions and receive answers from strangers around the world. There was the women's magazine, which was enormously important. There was the beauty parlor, which was enormously important in a different way. And there were other women, mothers, sisters, neighbors, friends, who were the most important conduit of all. The knowledge that a 14-year-old girl had about skincare by the time she finished high school in 1955 was knowledge she had received from her mother's friends, from the older girls at school, from the beauty operator who did her mother's hair and who had watched her grow up, and who had at some point turned to her with a small piece of advice that stuck. It was accumulated, specific, experiential knowledge, passed through demonstration as much as through words. A mother teaching her daughter to apply lipstick did not hand her a tutorial. She handed her the lipstick and watched her try, and then adjusted the angle of the daughter's wrist and demonstrated the blotting technique and explained about the liner and answered the daughter's questions with the patience of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. The knowledge was embodied in a way that written advice could not fully replicate. This meant that the specific practices a woman carried into adulthood reflected the specific knowledge of the specific women who had been around her in girlhood. Women who grew up near beauty operators learned to approach their hair with the systematic rigor of a professional. Women who grew up with mothers who used simple home remedies carried those remedies forward and added to them from their own experience. Women who grew up in Italian-American households carried the olive oil tradition. Women who grew up in households where money was tight carried the resourcefulness that comes from having learnt to do more with less. The diversity of practice within the shared aesthetic standard of the decade was considerable. Every woman of the 1950s was working toward a similar result, the defined, polished, put-together look that the era required, but the specific path each woman took to get there was personal, inherited, accumulated, hers. And this is the last thing I want to say about the beauty of the 1950s woman, and it is the thing I think is most worth carrying with you into your own nights and mornings. The beauty was in the knowing, not in the specific product, not in the specific shade of lipstick, not in the particular way a curl fell across the temple. It was in the knowledge of herself that every woman who maintained these practices accumulated over the years, the deep, specific, daily renewed knowledge of her own face, her own hair, her own skin's particular responses to cold and heat, and sleep and stress, and the slow passage of time. Joan, standing at her bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning in 1952, was not looking at a face she didn't know. She knew every inch of it, in all its seasons, in all its moods, in every light. She knew what helped it and what didn't. She knew what it looked like at its best, and what she needed to do to get it there, and she did those things, daily, without thinking of them as remarkable, because they were just what you did when you took yourself seriously enough to show up in your own life fully prepared. There is beauty in that, real beauty, not the constructed, performed kind that the decade sometimes asked for and that we have rightly moved past, but the quieter, more durable kind, the beauty of a woman who knows herself and takes care of herself and does so without drama, without applause, without expecting anyone to notice anything except that she looks, as she always does, just as she should. The lights are lower now, the morning is far away. Joan has gone about her day, her curls smooth and her lipstick fresh, and her hands soft and her posture straight, carrying with her a lifetime of accumulated knowledge that she will pass on, piece by piece and gesture by gesture, to the women who come after her. And somewhere in the old women of today, in their particular way of blotting a lip, or pressing cold spoons to their eyes, or reaching for the petroleum jelly before bed, Joan lives, and her mother lives, and all the other ordinary, extraordinary women who knew things and did things and showed up, day after day, to the quiet, competent, beautiful work of taking care of themselves. Sleep well, friend. The mirror will still be there in the morning, and you will know what to do. Thank you for spending this night at Sleepy Old World. If the stories we share here feel like the kind of company you want to keep, come back any time. There are more evenings ahead, more lost worlds to step into, more women worth knowing about. Until then, rest easy. The night is soft, and you have everything you need. But let's not leave quite yet. There's more to the story of the 1950s woman and her beauty world. There is so much more, actually, because we've covered the basics of the daily routine, and we've talked about the philosophy underneath it, but we haven't fully inhabited the world yet. We haven't stood in it long enough to feel how it actually moved through the hours of a day. So let's go back in. Let's go deeper. Let's say it's a Saturday in September of 1953. Joan is not going to work. She doesn't have a job outside the house, or if she does, it's Tuesday through Friday, and Saturday belongs to the household. Her husband has gone to run an errand and won't be back until noon. The children are at the neighbor's yard next door, audible but not requiring supervision. The house is hers, and the morning is hers, and this is the moment she saves certain things for. She starts the water running in the bathroom and closes the door. The Saturday morning bath was different from the weekday morning wash. It was slower. There was time for it to be slower. Joan dissolves a handful of Epsom salts into the water. She buys them at the pharmacy in the large paper bag, because she uses them every week, and it makes no sense to buy the small bottle. And then she adds a capful of the lavender water she keeps on the bathroom shelf. The room fills with that particular warm, watery, faintly botanical smell that means Saturday morning to her in a way that no other smell does. She gets in while the water is still slightly too warm and lets her body adjust. She lies still for a few minutes and does nothing at all, which is not something she does on any other day of the week or allows herself in any other context. The nothing is part of the practice. The body needs, sometimes, to not be asked to do anything, just to float in warm water and breathe. After 10 minutes of that, she begins. The bath brush, a long-handled brush with natural bristles, is used on the body in long, firm strokes from the feet upward toward the heart. This practice, which women's magazines of the era sometimes called body brushing, and which was recommended for improving the texture of skin and stimulating circulation, is another one of those 1950s beauty habits that has been rediscovered several times in the decades since, and each time presented as if it were new. It isn't new, it's old. Joan learned it from a magazine article 3 years ago and has been doing it every Saturday since, because she noticed a difference in the texture of the skin on her thighs and upper arms within about a month of starting, and that was sufficient motivation to continue. The technique is simple: always upward, always toward the heart, avoiding the face and any area of broken or irritated skin, and using enough pressure to feel the brush working, but not so much pressure that it leaves the skin red and raw. The purpose is twofold. The physical exfoliation of the dry brush removes the dead surface layer of skin cells that accumulates between washings, allowing whatever you apply afterward to absorb better. And the motion toward the heart stimulates lymphatic drainage, the movement of fluid through the lymphatic system, which runs parallel to the circulatory system and is responsible for clearing cellular waste from the body's tissues. The lymphatic system has no pump. It moves by muscle contraction, and when you're being still and horizontal in a warm bath, it benefits from the mechanical assistance of a firm brush moving upward along the limbs. After the brushing, the bath itself, she uses a bar of soap she makes herself, or bought from the woman 2 streets over who makes it, a glycerin soap with oatmeal ground into it, and a little lavender oil, made in molds in a kitchen and sold at the church bazaar. It lathers differently from commercial soap, more softly and less dramatically, and it doesn't leave the same tight feeling on the skin afterward. She's been buying soap from the same woman for 4 years and has noticed that her skin is consistently less dry than it used to be in fall and winter. The hair. Joan's hair has been in pin curls since Wednesday night, and it's held reasonably well, but she decides on this particular Saturday morning that she's going to do the full treatment, shampoo and set, the way the beauty parlor does it, but at home on her own schedule, which means she has time to do it properly. She starts with the scalp oil treatment she does once a month. A tablespoon of olive oil, slightly warmed by sitting the small dish in the warm bath water for a few minutes, worked through the hair from root to tip with her fingers, and then massaged into the scalp with the pads of her fingers in small circular motions for a full 5 minutes. The massaging is the important part, not just the oil, but the physical stimulation of the scalp, which increases blood flow to the hair follicles, and which she can feel as a pleasant, warm tingle. She wraps a warm towel around her head and lets it sit for 20 minutes while she finishes her bath and gets out. The towel turban trick is essential. The warmth opens the hair cuticle slightly, allowing the oil to penetrate deeper than it would at room temperature. Women who did the oil treatment at room temperature without any heat activation reported less dramatic results than women who added the warm towel step, and the women who knew each other knew this and passed it along. When she rinses the oil out, she uses warm water first, then a thorough shampoo, the egg shampoo today, because she has eggs and because the protein treatment on top of the oil treatment will leave her hair in the best possible condition. She works the beaten egg through the hair quickly, because the water from the bath is cooling and she doesn't want it to get warm enough to cook. A rinse of cool water first, then slightly warmer once the egg is out, then the final rinse with diluted apple cider vinegar, 2 tablespoons in a cup of cool water, poured slowly over the hair and worked through with the fingers, left for a moment, then rinsed again with clean cool water. She towels her hair dry gently, never rubbing, always pressing and squeezing, because hair is most fragile when it's wet and rubbing it causes breakage. She combs through it with a wide-toothed comb, starting from the ends and working upward toward the root, never pulling, never forcing through a tangle. She takes her time. She has time. The setting lotion goes in next. She made a fresh batch this week, a cup of warm water with a teaspoon of gelatin dissolved in it, let cool to room temperature, and poured into a small spray bottle. She sprays this evenly over the damp hair, section by section, and then sits at her dressing table in her bathrobe to set the curlers. The dressing table itself is worth describing. It has belonged to her since she was married, and before that it belonged to her mother. The surface is covered with the accumulated geography of her beauty life, the glass bottles of various preparations at different stages of depletion, the powder puff resting in its little dish. The row of lipstick bullets in their cases arranged by color family, the small glass bowl where bobby pins collect. There's a pot of cold cream that's nearly empty and needs to be replaced, and a tube of hand cream that gets used more than anything else on the table. The mirror is lit by two small bulbs on either side that her husband installed 3 years ago because she asked him to, because the overhead light cast shadows that made it impossible to see what she was actually doing. She sets her hair in rows of large rollers for soft waves, not tight pin curls today, because she's planning to wear a softer style for the neighborhood dinner party tomorrow evening, and the larger rollers will give her the volume and movement she wants without the tight curl that pin curls produce. Each roller is secured with 2 clips, one at the front and one at the back, and she works methodically from the front hairline backward, making sure each section is smooth before it goes on the roller, because any unevenness in the winding creates a crease in the finished wave. When the last roller is in, she wraps a thin cotton scarf loosely over the whole set to protect it while it dries, and goes to make herself a cup of coffee. She will drink her coffee slowly. The rollers need at least an hour to dry completely. She reads the newspaper while they dry, a Saturday luxury, and lets her mind wander through the week that's passed and the week ahead. This is what the 1950s beauty routine was also doing, and what we haven't yet said clearly enough. It was providing the structure for quiet time, for the particular quality of solitude that comes when your hands are occupied but your mind is free. The women who set their own hair, who did their own weekly manicures, who performed the careful sequencing of the morning routine, they were not just maintaining their appearances, they were giving themselves, every day, a period of focused attention to themselves that required their full presence and that pushed out, temporarily, the noise of everything else. When Joan sits at the dressing table to set her hair, she is not thinking about the grocery list, or whether her mother-in-law liked the pot roast, or whether the school shoes need to be resoled. She is thinking about sections and rollers and the angle of each wave. She is doing something that requires her full attention, and that is entirely, completely about herself and her own face and hair and the small mastery of her own physical presentation. And in that space, she is briefly and thoroughly alone in a world that does not often give her that. This is not a small thing. It is in fact a deeply important thing. And the women who built these routines into the texture of their daily lives were, without exactly naming it as such, practicing a form of mindfulness decades before the word entered the popular vocabulary. After the rollers are dry, she checks by pressing gently through the scarf. If any roller feels cool and damp, it's not done, and rushing this step ruins the set. She returns to the dressing table to take them out. Out comes the scarf, out come the clips. Each roller is unwound from the back of the head forward, and the resulting curl is left completely untouched and allowed to cool for at least 5 minutes before any brush goes through it. This is the step that most women who try to set their own hair get wrong. They brush too soon. Touching a roller curl before it's cooled causes it to lose its shape immediately because the hair has not yet locked into its new structure. Letting the curls cool fully first is the difference between a set that holds all day and a set that falls within 2 hours. When she brushes, it's in long, smooth strokes that blend the individual curls together into waves. She can feel the set holding even as the brush moves through it. The gelatin and the cool temperature have done their work, and the hair is moving the way she wants it to move, settling into the soft, round shape she planned when she chose the roller size. She pins the sides back with a pair of pins she slides under the outer layer of hair so they're invisible from the front, secures the back with 3 more, and steps back to assess. Good, it's good. She will need to finish it tomorrow before the dinner party. A little more shaping, a spritz of hairspray, perhaps a small artificial flower pinned near the temple if she's feeling festive. But the foundation is excellent, and a night on a satin pillowcase will protect it until morning. She's been at this for 2 hours. She's in her bathrobe with her hair done and her face still bare, and it's 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning in September, and she feels absolutely fine about all of it. This is her work. She takes it seriously. It will be there to support everything else she does for the rest of the day. Now she does her face. Saturday face is slightly different from weekday face. More time, slightly more attention to the details that get abbreviated on a Tuesday morning, a minor luxury of not rushing. She begins with a warm cloth, holds it against her face for 30 seconds to open the pores and soften whatever has settled there since last night. Cold cream goes on and stays on for a full minute while she looks out the window at the maple tree losing its first leaves in the yard, thinking nothing in particular. She wipes it away and applies her witch hazel toner on a cotton ball, and she takes this step more seriously today than she does on weekdays. She does the full face, including behind the jaw and down onto the neck, taking her time with it. She follows with her moisturizer, let it absorb fully, then adds a small amount of a richer cream around the outer corners of her eyes and along the smile lines where the skin tends to be driest. She presses her ring fingers gently along the orbital bone, feeling the slight give in the skin under the pressure, working the cream in without pulling. She is 34 years old. Her face has the beginnings of the fine lines that every face begins to develop in the 30s, a slight crease at the corner of each eye, a hint of depth in the smile lines that wasn't there 5 years ago. She has looked at these with something approaching equanimity because she was prepared for them. Her mother had them at this age, and her mother's mother, and she knew they were coming, and she knows they are not the catastrophe that certain advertisements would like her to believe. They are her face at 34. She takes care of them the way she takes care of everything. Foundation goes on with a slightly damp sponge today, in small pressing applications rather than the quick sweep she uses on weekday mornings. The light of the Saturday morning through the bathroom window is more forgiving than she usually gets, and in it she can see exactly where the foundation is sitting evenly and where it needs a little more work. A patch of dryness near the nostril where the skin sometimes flakes slightly, a slightly uneven patch of color on the chin. She corrects these carefully. The powder is applied more sparingly today than usual because the foundation she chose is slightly more matte than the one she uses on weekdays. She read last month that matte foundations require less powder to set and look better with less, and she has found this to be true. She uses her powder puff in a gentle pressing motion rather than sweeping, which avoids disturbing the foundation layer underneath. She takes her time with her eyebrows today, fills them in with small, careful strokes, then blends the pencil marks with a clean mascara wand that she's repurposed for just this use, softening the lines until they look like hair rather than pencil. She steps back and checks from farther away. Yes, they're even. Yes, the arch is in the right place on each side. Good. Eyeshadow today, something she skips on busy weekday mornings, a pale, warm champagne on the lid, blended to nothing at the crease. A slightly deeper beige taupe at the outer corner, blended upward. Not dramatic, just awake, just present. The liner goes on carefully. She makes her small connected dot marks along the upper lash line, then connects them with a Q-tip wrapped in the finest possible layer of liner. The wing at the outer corner is small today, just enough to lift the eye slightly, not the more emphatic line she might wear in the evening. She cleans up the edge with a cotton swab dampened with a drop of cold cream, and the line is clean and precise, 2 coats of mascara drying between them. She doesn't wriggle the wand at the base the way some women do, that deposits too much product too close to the lid and can clump. She places the wand at the root of the lashes and strokes upward in a single smooth motion for each lash, working her way across from the inner to the outer corner, one eye at a time. The blush goes on last, before the lipstick. She uses the same coral shade she's been wearing all summer, pressed onto the ball of the brush and then blown lightly to remove any excess, a trick she learned from the beauty parlor operator who blew excess product off the brush before every application because the difference between the right amount of color and too much was often a matter of a single breath. Swept onto the apples of the cheeks, blended upward and slightly toward the temple, very soft, just enough warmth. And then the lip. She lines first with her matching lip pencil, following the natural curve of her lip precisely today rather than the slight overdraw she sometimes uses for evening. Saturday morning is not evening, and the liner should be more natural, more workday. She fills in the lined area with the pencil and then applies her lipstick over it, the coral that matches the blush, blots with a tissue folded in half and pressed between the lips rather than rubbed, applies the second coat, presses with the tissue again. She steps back from the mirror and looks at herself for a moment. Saturday morning, in her bathrobe, hair done, face done, and she looks like herself. She looks like herself at 34 in September, in a bathroom that smells of lavender and Epsom salts and the faintest trace of the coffee from downstairs. She looks, she thinks, quite all right. She changes into a house dress and goes down to begin the day. The house dress is worth a brief mention because even the clothing worn at home for housework was not entirely without consideration in this decade. The house dress, a simple washable cotton dress that served as the working uniform of domestic life, was not glamorous, was not intended to be glamorous, but it was chosen. Joan has 3 or 4 that she rotates through the week, and though they are simple, they fit reasonably, and they are clean, and they have buttons rather than zippers, because she is a woman who prefers buttons, and that preference matters to her even in her own kitchen on a Saturday morning when no one will see her until her husband comes home at noon. The apron that goes over the house dress when she's cooking is a proper apron, full bib, ties behind the neck and the waist, large enough to actually protect the dress underneath. She's made several of them herself from cotton fabric bought at the dry goods store, in cheerful prints, because the cheerful prints make her feel better on days when the housework feels like a lot. This is a small thing, and it is also not a small thing. It's the same principle as the rest. When you take care of how things look, you take care of how you feel, and when you feel well, you function better. The shoe choice, even for a Saturday at home, is not completely casual. Joan wears house shoes with a small heel, not stiletto, not even a real heel, but a small, shaped wedge that's comfortable for standing, but that maintains the slightly erect posture that a completely flat shoe doesn't. She has flat slippers, and she wears them sometimes, but she knows from experience that a day spent entirely in completely flat shoes leaves her back aching by dinner time in a way that even a modest heel avoids. This is partly because the natural pitch of the foot when wearing a small heel redistributes the work of standing across the muscles of the leg in a slightly different way, engaging the calf and the hip flexor that flat shoes don't fully activate. She doesn't know the anatomy. She knows that her back hurts less. She moves through the housework with the same systematic quality she brings to the beauty routine, not hurrying, not dawdling, working through a sequence she has refined over years of practice until it runs as efficiently as possible. The bedroom first, made and tidied, the bathroom after that, wiped down, the kitchen swept and the dishes dealt with from breakfast. Then the more substantial tasks of the week, the laundry or the ironing, depending on what she got to last week. The floors, either swept and mopped or run over with the new electric vacuum that she loves, with an enthusiasm she doesn't bother concealing from anyone. Around noon her husband comes home, and they have lunch together at the kitchen table. Simple, not fussed over, whatever is in the refrigerator assembled into something reasonable. She's been preparing food since she could reach the stove. The assembly of a lunch from available ingredients takes her approximately 10 minutes and requires approximately no conscious thought. In the afternoon, depending on the week and the weather and what needs doing, she might garden, or she might visit a neighbor for coffee, or she might sit at the kitchen table with the week's correspondence, the thank you notes that have accumulated and need to be written, the birthday card for her sister-in-law due next week, and write in the careful, clear cursive she was taught in school and has kept up through decades of practice. The evening is for the family, for dinner, which she plans with the same systematic attention she brings to everything else, and for the time afterward, the dishes and the children settled for the night, and then whatever quiet the late evening provides. She will go to bed at a reasonable hour. She will remove her makeup carefully, every trace of it, with cold cream on a cloth. She will apply her night cream to her face and neck. She will put her hair up in pin curls or rollers depending on where in the week she is, or if the Saturday set is holding, she will simply tie the silk scarf around it and leave it. She will apply her hand cream and pull on the thin cotton gloves she keeps on her nightstand for this purpose, and then she will sleep, properly, completely, in the knowledge that she has maintained what needs maintaining and prepared for what needs preparing, and that tomorrow's face will be there for her in the mirror, familiar and cared for and ready to face what the day asks of it. There is, in all of this, a kind of grace that I don't think the decade itself quite recognized or named. It was too close to it. It couldn't see the shape of what it was doing because it was inside it. But from this distance, looking back, What the 1950s woman's relationship to her own physical self looks like is this. It looks like taking yourself seriously. It looks like deciding that your face and your body and your hair and your posture are worth your time and your attention and your skill. It looks like the deep, quiet, unshowy commitment to showing up every day for yourself before you show up for anyone else. We could argue, and there are good arguments to be made, that the era's beauty standards were too narrow, too demanding, too contingent on a specific kind of femininity that left many women out and that cost even the women who succeeded at it more than it should have. Those arguments are right. The decade's relationship to women's bodies and women's self-presentation was complicated, and some of what it asked for was unfair. But the practices, the actual practices, separated from the social obligation that surrounded them, the cold cream and the good sleep and the water and the careful diet and the warm bath and the consistent attention to the face and hair and hands and posture, these practices are not unfair. They are not gendered in any essential way. They are just the maintenance of a physical self, done consistently and intelligently for a lifetime. And the results of that maintenance, visible in the faces and bodies of the women who practiced it into old age, were remarkable. Let's talk about the specific formulas and recipes that circulated among women of the era, because these are genuinely interesting from a scientific standpoint and also genuinely effective in a practical one. The rose glycerin recipe that appeared in various women's magazines of the decade was one of the most widely reproduced beauty formulations of the era. Equal parts glycerin and rosewater, mixed in a small bottle and applied to the face and hands as a light moisturizer. Glycerin is a humectant. It draws water from the air to the skin's surface, literally pulling moisture from the environment and holding it against your face. In humid climates, glycerin-based preparations are incredibly effective moisturizers, far more effective, measure for measure, than oil-based products. In very dry climates, they can paradoxically pull moisture from the skin rather than from the air, so they work better in combination with an oil-based product, or used on top of another moisturizer that seals the glycerin in place. Women who lived in reasonably humid environments and used this rose glycerin formula found that their hands stayed remarkably soft even through winter and through the drying work of frequent dishwashing. Women who lived in arid climates found it less satisfactory on its own, but effective as a layer under their regular hand cream. This geographic variation in experience produced some of the contradictory advice that circulated in the beauty culture. This works, no it doesn't, depending on where the woman reporting had tried it. The almond oil treatment, used for dry skin around the eyes and on the body, was another standard formula of the decade. Sweet almond oil is a light, odorless oil high in oleic acid and linoleic acid, two fatty acids that closely resemble the natural fats in human skin and are therefore very well tolerated and very well absorbed. Applied around the eye at night, it provides genuine moisturizing in an area where the skin is too thin and too sensitive for most commercial products. Applied to the body after bathing, it absorbs quickly and doesn't leave the greasy feel that heavier mineral oils can leave. Women who used sweet almond oil around their eyes consistently through their 30s and 40s often had noticeably less pronounced under-eye crepiness at 50 than women who neglected the area or used inappropriate products there. The skin around the eye needs light, compatible oils applied gently. The almond oil that women in the 1950s bought from the pharmacy in small glass bottles at modest cost was, in terms of what it did for that specific area, genuinely superior to many expensive modern eye treatments. The lemon sugar scrub for the body and lips was another kitchen cabinet beauty formula that circulated widely. A tablespoon of granulated sugar mixed with just enough lemon juice to make a paste. Rub gently over the lips or the rough skin of elbows and heels. Rinse clean. This is physical exfoliation combined with mild chemical exfoliation from the citric acid in the lemon juice, and it works. The sugar abrades the dead surface cells, and the acid helps dissolve the bonds holding those cells to the surface, so the exfoliation is both mechanical and chemical, more thorough than either alone. The result is smoother skin immediately, with the skin underneath appearing brighter because the dead surface layer that was diffusing the light has been removed. Women who used this treatment on their lips before applying lipstick for an important occasion reported that their lipstick applied more evenly, more brightly, and lasted longer than on days when they went directly to lipstick on unexfoliated lips. This is simply true. Smooth lips hold pigment more evenly than rough ones, and the absence of the dead surface layer allows the color to make contact with the healthier skin underneath, which grips it better. The milk compress for sunburned skin. Whole milk, applied on soft cloths to burned or irritated skin and left for 15 to 20 minutes, was a remedy that every woman knew and that works genuinely well. The fat and protein content of whole milk, combined with the mild lactic acid it contains, creates a soothing, slightly cooling compress that reduces the heat of inflammation and begins to address the skin damage underneath. The lactic acid is particularly useful because it's a gentle AHA, alpha hydroxy acid, that helps the damaged surface layer of skin release more evenly rather than peeling in uneven, uncomfortable sheets. Women in the 1950s didn't know the phrase alpha hydroxy acid, but they knew that the milk helped the peel happen better, and they were right. The vinegar toner for the scalp was used specifically for dandruff. The apple cider vinegar diluted in water and massaged into the scalp before shampooing, then rinsed completely out. Dandruff is typically caused by an overgrowth of a fungus called Malassezia that lives naturally on all scalps but proliferates in certain conditions, producing the flaking and irritation associated with the condition. The mildly acidic environment created by diluted apple cider vinegar is hostile to this fungus and helps control its growth, which is why regular ACV scalp treatments reduce dandruff in women who are prone to it. Women who discovered this through their own experimentation, noticing that their scalp was less irritated after an ACV rinse and gradually incorporating it more regularly, were practicing a kind of empirical science that required no laboratory, no training, no advanced education, just attention, just the willingness to notice cause and effect in their own bodies and adjust accordingly. The chamomile tea for blonde hair highlights was another beauty remedy that circulated widely and that has genuine chemistry behind it. Chamomile contains apigenin, a compound that reacts with sunlight to produce a mild lightening effect on lighter hair colors. Women who made strong chamomile tea cooled it and then used it as a final rinse after shampooing, or applied it to their damp hair before sitting in the sun for an hour, were using a genuine photochemical lightening agent. The effect was subtle and gradual, nothing like the dramatic results of chemical bleaching, but for women with naturally blonde or light brown hair who wanted their summer highlights to develop more evenly or to last a little longer into fall, it was genuinely useful. Tea was also used to darken hair, or rather to add warmth and depth to hair that had become dull or slightly brassy. Strong black tea, cooled and used as a rinse, deposits a small amount of tannin on the hair shaft that adds depth and warmth to darker hair colors. It's a temporary effect that washes out gradually over the following shampoos, but it was a useful between-appointment color refresh for women who were touching up their dye at the salon every 6 weeks and whose color began to look a little flat in the 4th or 5th week. Henna, which is derived from the Lawsonia inermis plant and has been used for hair coloring since antiquity, was used by women in the 1950s who wanted warm red tones in their hair without the harsh chemical processes of contemporary dye. True henna deposits a red-orange pigment on the hair shaft. It doesn't penetrate into the cortex of the hair the way chemical dye does. It coats the outside, which means it doesn't lighten the hair but adds warmth and richness and shine to hair that is naturally dark enough to carry the tone. It also strengthens the hair shaft slightly, because the deposit of henna molecules adds a thin protective layer to the outside of each strand. Women who used henna regularly had hair that was noticeably stronger and shinier than their unpigmented counterparts, and a rich warmth to their color that chemical dyeing of the era was less able to reliably produce. The compromise was that henna is permanent in a different sense than chemical dye. It cannot be chemically lifted or over-dyed with most other products without unpredictable results. You committed to henna and you maintained it, or you grew it out. Women who understood this commitment made it deliberately and kept it faithfully. The practice of using castor oil for thickening the eyebrows and lashes is documented in beauty advice columns of the decade, and again there's something interesting in it from a modern perspective. Castor oil is one of the highest natural concentrations of ricinoleic acid, a fatty acid with documented anti-inflammatory properties. Applied regularly to the brow or lash line with a clean mascara wand or a cotton swab, it appears to support the health of the hair follicles in those areas, potentially reducing the loss of existing hairs and supporting slightly fuller growth over time. The evidence for this from modern research is modest, but enough to explain why women who tried it and paid attention over several months reported seeing some improvement. For women with sparse brows, and the high-arch plucked brow of the early 1950s had left many of them with brows that never quite grew back fully, a consequence of repeated overplucking that can eventually damage the follicle permanently. The castor oil treatment was pursued with particular hope. The results were mixed, as they tend to be with follicle regeneration, but the ritual of the treatment itself was part of what kept women attending to it. It required only a minute every evening, it was completely comfortable, and the hope it provided was worth something regardless of whether the science fully supported it. Now, let's turn to something we've only touched on lightly, the specific beauty practices of women of color in the 1950s, which deserve their own real discussion rather than a passing acknowledgement. Black women in the 1950s existed within and also entirely apart from the mainstream beauty industry. The industry itself was not serving them. The foundation shades, the hair products designed for straight European hair textures, the advertising imagery that defined beauty as narrow-featured, pale-skinned and straight-haired, all of this was not for black women. The industry was clear about this through its exclusion, and black women responded with exactly the self-reliant creativity that exclusion so often produces. The black beauty culture of the 1950s was deep, rich, sophisticated, and largely invisible to the white mainstream. It had its own publications. Ebony magazine, launched in 1945, carried extensive beauty coverage oriented toward black women's actual needs and actual aesthetics. It had its own product lines, companies like Madam CJ, Walker's, which had been founded in the 1910s and was still producing, and a growing number of mid-century black-owned beauty companies developing products specifically for black women's hair and skin. Hair care for black women in the 1950s centered around a specific set of practices and tools that had been developed over generations. The hot comb, a metal comb heated on the stove or in a special heater and then drawn through sections of hair to temporarily straighten it, was a staple tool, operated with skill developed over years of practice and passed from mother to daughter in kitchens across America. The hot comb required knowing your tool, how hot was hot enough, how hot was too hot, how quickly to draw it through a section, how to hold the hair taut so the comb moved smoothly without snagging. The grease that was applied to the hair before hot combing, usually a petroleum-based pomade or a mixture of castor oil and other oils, served to protect the hair from the heat of the comb and to smooth the cuticle as the heat worked. Different women and different hair types required different amounts of grease. Too little and the comb caught and pulled, too much and the hair was heavy and didn't achieve the smooth gleaming finish that was the goal. The result of a good hot comb straightening, done skillfully, was hair of tremendous beauty, smooth, glossy, with a shine that came from the combination of the oils and the heat sealing the cuticle flat, and a range of possible styles from the short, shaped cuts common in the decade to long, dressed styles of genuine elegance. Black women in the 1950s who wore these styles wore them with the pride of a tradition passed to them through generations of women who had refined a set of practices under difficult circumstances into something genuinely accomplished. Skincare for black women in this decade was practiced with many of the same underlying principles as for white women: cleansing, moisturizing, sun protection, but with attention to the specific needs of darker skin tones that the mainstream beauty press rarely acknowledged. Hyperpigmentation, the darkening of patches of skin in response to inflammation, sun exposure, or hormonal changes, is more visible and more common in darker skin tones, and the remedies for it circulated among black women the same way other beauty remedies circulated, through conversation, through the beauty salon, through the beauty press that was actually talking to them. Lemon juice applied to areas of hyperpigmentation was a common treatment. The vitamin C and citric acid in lemon juice have genuine lightening properties that can fade post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation over time. Applied carefully with a cotton ball to the darkened area and rinsed after a few minutes, it was less effective but far safer than some of the more aggressive skin lightening products that were marketed to women of color in this era. and that contained genuinely harmful bleaching agents. The black beauty salon was, if anything, even more powerfully a social institution than its white counterpart. The specific intimacy of hair care for black women, the time required, the physical closeness, the vulnerability of the client in the hands of the operator, created bonds of trust and candor that made the salon a space unlike any other. Women talked there in ways they didn't talk anywhere else, and what they talked about helped them survive the specific difficulties of their lives in ways that extended far beyond the beauty they left with.
This is not a digression from the beauty history of the 1950s.
It is the beauty history of the 1950s, all of it, together. The white woman in her bathroom, and the black woman in her kitchen, and the Mexican-American woman in her dressing room, and the immigrant woman of any number of origins, doing what women have always done with the knowledge they were given, and the tools they could access, and the specific expertise they had developed through the accumulation of years, each of them attending to themselves, taking themselves seriously, showing up for the work of their own physical presentation with the dignity and the competence that the work deserves. One more thread worth pulling: the beauty practices around the menstrual cycle, because this is another area where the 1950s women's collective wisdom was specific and practical in ways that have since been largely forgotten. The relationship between the menstrual cycle and the skin's condition was understood observationally, even when the hormonal mechanisms weren't fully clear. Women noticed, because they paid enough attention to their own bodies to notice, that their skin changed in predictable ways through the cycle. In the days before menstruation, the skin often became oilier, more prone to breakouts, slightly more sensitive and reactive to products that it tolerated easily at other times. During menstruation itself, some women found their skin particularly dull and pale. After menstruation, in the follicular phase of the cycle, the skin often improved dramatically, more clear, more elastic, more receptive to everything applied to it. The practical response was to adjust the routine accordingly. In the premenstrual days, lighter products and more thorough cleansing, a clay mask during this time, when the skin was at its oiliest, to absorb the excess sebum, avoidance of anything heavily fragranced or containing potential irritants, because premenstrual skin is more reactive. During the follicular phase, slightly richer products, the opportunity for treatments that might irritate sensitive skin at other times, the lemon sugar scrub, a stronger toner, the deep conditioning hair treatment that's easier to rinse when the skin is less reactive. This cyclical tuning of the beauty routine to the body's own rhythms was practiced without a clinical framework by women who were simply paying attention, and it produced better results than a static routine applied uniformly through all phases would have produced. The principle is the same one, underlying the cyclical skincare movements that have become popular in recent years. The idea that the skin has its own rhythm and benefits from treatments calibrated to where it is in that rhythm, rather than a one-size-fits-all approach applied regardless of what the body is doing. Castor oil packs, a piece of flannel soaked in castor oil, placed over the lower abdomen and covered with a hot water bottle, were used by women experiencing difficult periods to ease cramping. The warmth, combined with the anti-inflammatory properties of the ricinoleic acid in the castor oil, does provide genuine relief for the kind of smooth muscle cramping associated with menstrual pain. Women who used this treatment regularly during their periods often reported that it was more helpful than aspirin for the dull, heavy ache of difficult cramping, though it did nothing for the sharper, more acute pain of severe dysmenorrhea. These were not beauty practices in the cosmetic sense, but they were part of the same philosophy: paying attention to your body, responding to what it tells you, using the tools at your disposal with knowledge and skill, and the willingness to adapt based on what you observe. This philosophy of attention, response, and adaptation is the thread that runs through every single practice we've discussed tonight. It's what makes the cold cream different from a miracle cream, the egg shampoo different from a magic treatment, the morning glass of water different from a cure. None of these things is a cure, none of them is a miracle. They are practices, sustained over time, informed by attention, producing their cumulative results not in a single morning, but over the long arc of a life. The 1950s woman who looked wonderful at 60 had looked wonderful at 50 and at 40 and at 35, not because she'd found a secret, but because she had shown up every day for 30 years with a glass of water and a jar of cold cream and a roll of curlers and an extraordinary, quietly magnificent patience with the slow work of taking care of herself. There is a lesson in this that is genuinely applicable today, and it's the same lesson that the healthiest, best-maintained women in any era have always known. Start now, be consistent, pay attention, and trust the compound interest of daily care. The shortcuts don't work as well as the basics. The basics, applied consistently, work better than almost anything else. And the self-knowledge that comes from paying close daily attention to your own face and body, knowing what your skin needs in January versus July, knowing what your hair does on the third day after washing versus the first, knowing which colors make your face look alive and which ones flatten it, that self-knowledge is irreplaceable, and it can only be accumulated through the patient, unspectacular practice of showing up every morning to look yourself clearly and honestly in the face. Joan knows this. She's known it since she was 17 and watched her mother at the dressing table, and she will know it until she's 87 and sitting at her own dressing table with arthritic fingers and a face that has recorded every year of her life and that she still takes care of, still presents with pride, still prepares with the morning glass of water and the cold cream and the careful lipstick that has been coral and rose and brick red and all the various shades of a life well lived in a body well attended. She will pass this on. She has already begun to pass it on to her daughter, who is 11 and already watching with interest from the doorway of the bathroom while Joan does her face, asking questions that Joan answers fully and without condescension, because these are real questions about real things that matter. One day the daughter will stand at her own bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning, in a world Joan can't quite picture, and she will reach without thinking for the right tool in the right order, and she will know why, and she will do it well, because she was shown. Because someone took the time and the trouble to show her. Because the knowledge moved forward through time the way it always has and always will, from hand to hand and face to face, between women who know and women who are learning, in the warm, particular light of early morning, before the day has asked anything of anyone yet. Sleep well, friend. The morning is a long way off, and there's no need to hurry toward it.